Bedtime Reading. The Secret Agent. Chapter 1. In the morning, Mr. Verloc left his store with his wife's brother, which was easily done because he hardly ever had customers, especially late in the afternoon. His store was located in the same building as his house. He sold mainly pictures of naked women, sex books, and a couple of funny French cartoon books. These goods usually attracted either very young or very old men. Both types were quite shy about being seen walking into the store. The old men would wear long coats with the collars turned up in order to hide their faces. The young men, on the other hand, would stand on the sidewalk, trying to seem uninterested while taking secret looks at the pictures in the window. Then, when they knew what they wanted, they would run in, buy it, and run back out. Mr. Verloc did not care about his store at all. He did not keep his appearance nice and clean for the customers, nor was he very friendly to them. When the broken bell at the top of the door announced that a new customer had arrived, he would walk from his home to the shop and stand silently behind the counter, waiting for the person to buy something expensive and useless. In the evenings, Mrs. Verloc worked in the store. This often made the customers, all of them being men, of course, quite uncomfortable. However, it was good for business, because people would also buy other things, like pens or envelopes, in order to make it seem like they had not come only to buy dirty pictures. Most people who came in the evening were not customers, however. Instead of looking around the shop, they would say hello to Mrs. Verloc and walk directly to the back of the store and down some stairs. There was only one entrance and exit from the house, and that was through the door of the store. Mr. Verloc did not often leave his home. He found that everything he needed to do could be done there. Life at home was quite comfortable for him, because his wife took very good care of him. He also had his wife's mother around the house. She had once owned an old hotel with a bar on the first floor. It was located in an area that used to be considered very wealthy, but was now less fashionable. She rented rooms to anyone who needed them. Most of her customers were quite poor and less than perfect gentlemen. Mrs. Verloc's mother was quite old and had bad legs. In order to keep the business going, Mrs. Verloc had worked in the bar. She was good at the job, for she was beautiful and enjoyed talking with the customers. Before they were married, Mr. Verloc was a frequent visitor of the hotel. He would leave the hotel late in the evening and return very early in the morning. He always told the young barkeeper that he had just come back from abroad, where he had been doing business. He never made clear what kind of business he had done. When they got married, Mr. Verloc decided that his mother-in-law's business would have to be sold so that he and his wife could start their own business. They moved into the home that was described earlier, and Mr. Verloc began to spend most of his evenings out. The result was that Winnie hardly ever saw him and was never taken out for a night on the town, like a good husband would do. When she asked him what kind of work he did, he would only say that it was related to politics. She accepted this and treated his political friends very well when they occasionally came over in the evenings. When Mr. Verloc's mother-in-law moved in with her daughter and son-in-law, her health got worse. She could no longer walk at all. Realizing the kind of shop that Mr. Verloc owned, she was a little surprised. However, she accepted it because she liked him. It made her happy to know that both her daughter and son, Stevie, would be taken care of for the rest of their lives. She was especially worried about Stevie because he had a disability that would make him like a child for all of his life. Winnie was very close to her brother and planned to always care for him in the future. Stevie worked as Mr. Verloc's delivery boy. However, because he found everything on the street so interesting, he would often make mistakes or forget where he was going. When he was 14, a friend of the family gave him a job in his office helping the workers with small tasks. One day, however, he surprised everyone in the company by lighting many fireworks inside the building. The loud noise and smoke frightened many people and caused them to run outside, fearing for their lives. When asked why he had done it, Stevie said that 2 other boys in the company had upset him. The manager fired him immediately. It was clear that Stevie would not be able to work among the rest of society. Now, he had a room on the first floor of Mr. Verloc's home, next to his mother's. When he was not helping his sister with housework, he spent his time drawing circles on a piece of paper with a pencil. Chapter 2. It was 10:30 in the morning when Mr. Verloc left his home. He felt better than usual on this day. He was clean and well-dressed. The sun was shining down on him and lighting up the world around him, making everything a soft golden color. He watched as people passed him on the street, as carriages speeded by. He noticed the beauty of the old buildings, and he felt that all of these people and things needed to be kept safe. He did not want his country falling under the influence of a government that pushed hard labor upon its people. He himself was very lazy and felt that hard work was a useless waste of time. As a result, Mr. Verloc was a rather fat man. He did not have the look of a proper gentleman. He looked more like an owner of a very small business. There was also something about him that somehow made it obvious he was involved in activities that were against the law. But he was still a friendly-looking fellow. He turned down a very small street that was so clean and well-kept that it seemed like he had entered another world in which things never get dirty, grow old, or die. And the quiet made it seem that he was far away from the craziness of London. On his left was the building he had been looking for, 10 Chesham Square. It was an embassy. The doorman allowed Mr. Verloc to enter without any trouble. Inside the entrance hall was a man reading a newspaper in front of a fireplace. The man looked up from the paper with a very serious face, briefly looked to see who had entered, and then returned his eyes to the paper, as if no one were in the room at all. Then a servant asked for Mr. Verloc's name, and after hearing it, led him down the hall and into a small room. He was left alone, with the door shut for a few moments, until another door opened behind him. A small, bald man with a gray beard quietly entered, holding some papers in his hands. He wore a pair of small glasses on his serious face. His name was Wurmt, and he served as one of the counselors for the ambassador. Neither he nor Mr. Verloc said hello. Instead, Wurmt went straight to business. He threw the papers he was holding onto the table, and, pointing his finger at them, said, "These are the reports you have given us." Verloc did not respond. "We have found that the police are quite unsatisfactory here," Wurmt continued. "It is important that they wake up and do their jobs. It seems that they feel they have nothing to do. Well, we want to give them something to do." Again, Mr. Verloc had nothing to say. "This country needs more control over its people. It's embarrassing to see the government act so weakly. There must be a dangerous criminal population among the people somewhere." "Of course there is," Verloc now spoke. "It's obvious from my reports that—" "Your reports are useless," Wurmt interrupted him. "We need action from you now, no more writing." "At your service, sir," Mr. Verloc said, trying to show his sincerity by standing up straight, sticking out his chest, and making a fist with his right hand. The councillor simply looked at him for a short while. "You're very fat," he finally said. Mr. Verloc took one step back and lifted his eyebrows. "What?" "Yes, well, I've nothing more to say. I'll take you to see Mr. Vladimir. Come with me, won't you?" Mr. Vladimir's office was on the second floor of the embassy. When Wurmt and Verloc arrived there, they found him seated in a leather chair behind a very long desk. He appeared to be rather young. He spoke in French to Wurmt. "Yes, he is very fat." Mr. Vladimir was a well-liked man among the rich and powerful people of London. He was considered quite good at pointing out the strange things about society in a funny, light-hearted way, and was quite a favorite at parties. However, at this moment, he showed a different side to his character, a much less friendly one. "You speak French?" he asked Verloc. "Yes, I learned it when I was in the military," he answered. "Right. How long did the French government put you in prison for stealing their new gun designs?" 5 years. "Well, you deserved it for letting them catch you. Anyway, why are you here?" "I received a letter asking me to come," Verloc answered, trying to find the paper in his pocket. "I don't believe that there should be any government, actually. Because of this, your embassy finds me useful." "Ah, so you're a rebel. Well, you're not a very intelligent rebel, are you? Getting caught like that by the French. I suppose that it was a girl that got you caught, wasn't it?" Mr. Verloc chose not to say anything and simply looked at the floor. "It was. But by looking at you, I would say that you were caught because you are also very lazy. How long have you been working for this embassy?" "I've been working for 11 years. I was asked to move to London by the former ambassador so that I could perform my job better." "Yes. Well, let me be the first to inform you that the new ambassador will not allow laziness among his workers. We want action from our secret agents. We need results," he shouted. Mr. Verloc explained that he was an active rebel who always attended revolutionary meetings and even was encouraged to speak at them, especially when an important point was trying to be made. "I have a very huge voice. Watch. I'll show you." He walked over to the window and, without much effort, called to a policeman who was standing a long distance from the embassy. The officer on the street immediately turned around and looked for who had called him. Mr. Vladimir, however, did not seem impressed. He said something in Latin, but Mr. Verloc obviously did not understand. "I see that you don't speak Latin," he said, clearly meaning that he thought Mr. Verloc quite stupid. "You fool! We don't need your voice. We need action." "Don't think that you can talk down to me like that," Verloc answered him angrily. "I won't allow it." Mr. Vladimir smiled and then began to speak in French. "You've not been useful to us in quite a long time." Why, I've done all— Have a look at these papers we found on the street, he interrupted Mr. Verloc, pointing to several revolutionary letters. The symbol at the top of all of the pages had a pen and a torch crossed over each other. "I'm one of the leaders of this organization," Mr. Verloc said proudly. "We call it FP, the Future of the People." "Well, why doesn't your organization do something more important than just make these stupid letters to the public? I've got something for you to do, and it's going to require a lot of hard work. If you don't succeed, then you won't get paid. We're not a charity organization here." Mr. Vladimir looked up and down at the man standing before him. He could not believe that this was the same man that the former ambassador, Baron Stadt-Wartenheim, had praised as his best secret agent. This was the man whose information influenced the decisions of some of the most powerful people in Europe? What a joke! But then he remembered how crazy the Baron had really been. Everyone in Europe had laughed at his lack of trust of others. He would probably have believed anything these secret agents told him. "We've called you here because an important international meeting is being held in Italy. In this meeting, leaders from all over Europe will come together to decide about how to fight crime in their country. We want them to use very strong methods of control over the people, but we know that they will not do this unless they feel it is necessary. We want to make it necessary. Do you understand?" Mr. Verloc did understand, and he waited silently for Mr. Vladimir to tell him how he wanted it made necessary. "We want something big to happen, and it needs to be important to the people. Now, what is everyone so interested in these days?" he asked. Mr. Verloc had no idea. "My God, man! Science! It's science that people are so interested in. Not religion or the king and queen. Too many leaders have been killed in the past for that to be an effective way of communicating to the people. Churches are also bad to destroy, because then people think you did it for religious reasons. Marketplaces and theaters are no good because there's no political message being sent when such places are bombed. No, in order to get everyone's attention, you need to attack something that they would never expect. And the importance of science these days is very obvious. The people to whom we are trying to communicate the most, the middle class, feel that their wealth actually depends on science. And that's where you should aim your bombs." Then a sudden proud smile appeared on Vladimir's face, seeming to indicate that he was about to reach the best part of his little speech. "You're going to bomb the Greenwich Astronomical Center, the place that the whole world looks to when they set their clocks. That will get everyone's attention, won't it?" Mr. Verloc stood silently for a moment, thinking to himself. Then, without looking up at Mr. Vladimir, he said, "That won't be easy, and it will require a lot of money." "Ha! You'll get nothing more unless you successfully do the job. What else do you do for money?" "My wife and I have a store. We sell paper and pens." "Are you joking, man? You're married? Rebels aren't supposed to be married. I'm seriously beginning to wonder if you're really the right man for this job." Mr. Verloc, who had been trying not to get angry, was beginning to lose control of himself. He pressed his lips together and made his eyes small. "You have 1 month to do what I have told you. If nothing happens within that time, we will no longer consider you useful. That is all. Now, go." Mr. Verloc then returned home, feeling troubled and quite unhappy. When he arrived, he found Stevie cleaning the house and his wife busy in the kitchen. He sat down on a chair in the room behind the store and pushed his hat toward the back of his head. Mrs. Verloc noticed this, but, being so busy, did not think it was very important. An hour and a half later, when she had prepared the table for a meal, she saw that he was still sitting in the same position.
"Adolph,"
she called to him.
"it's time to eat."
He slowly got up and joined his family at the dinner table. He did not say a word, and everyone noticed that he seemed more troubled than usual. Still, no one said anything to him. The two women worried that Stevie might upset Mr. Verloc at any moment by beginning to talk nonsense. They had been so used to doing their best to control Stevie's behavior years ago in order to avoid his father's terrible anger. They still found themselves feeling nervous at such moments, even though Mr. Verloc was not likely to get angry. Mr. Verloc did not love the boy, however. He looked at Stevie in the same way that other men, who don't like animals, look at their girlfriend's pet cat. Both Mrs. Verloc and her mother could see this. They knew it must be hard for people to accept Stevie, and they were just grateful that Mr. Verloc continued to allow him to live in his home. Chapter 3. "I have had a lot of time to think about things," said Michaelis, who had just recently been released from prison after spending 15 years there. The police were still watching him very closely. "I've come to the conclusion that it's economics that causes change in the world. Everything that happens is based on the economy, everything." On the other side of the room, a laugh could be heard coming from the toothless mouth of Karl Jund. He was quite old and had lost all of his hair. Although he had become very weak with age, there seemed to be enough strength in him to commit one last murder. He liked to call himself the terrorist. "The world needs to be led by men with no pity for anyone or anything," he said. "Cold, heartless men can destroy without feeling guilty. But where are these men? I've only found 3 in my entire lifetime." Then small clouds of smoke appeared from another part of the room where Comrade Ossipon was seated. He had written most of the letters that their organization, FP, had been putting up on walls around the city. His face had the look of a common criminal, a wide, flat nose surrounded by little dark spots, with a large mouth spreading into an ugly smile underneath. Most people called him the doctor, because he had once been a medical student, although he had never finished his studies. He stood up from his chair and opened the door to Mr. Verloc's card-playing room. Inside, Stevie could be seen sitting at a table drawing hundreds of circles on a white piece of paper. Ossipon said. "This kind of behavior is common among idiots." "He's not an idiot," answered Mr. Verloc. "Scientists would say that he's an idiot." Mr. Verloc did not like hearing the word science. It reminded him too much of Mr. Vladimir and gave him an ill feeling deep in his stomach. "If we're patient enough, we'll soon see the world change before our eyes. Capitalism is dying, I'm telling you." Michaelis continued.
So we should just sit around and wait? Just let time change the world? Asked Ossipon.
No, there must be a revolution some day. First, however, we must educate the people with our letters. We must go out among them and speak to them, teach them.
It's not education, but emotion that causes the people to want change, argued Ossipon. If you ask me, Carl Jung said, the whole economic system has turned to shit. The rich drinking the blood of the poor.
Stevie, having stopped his drawing a moment ago, heard this last sentence. It made him very frightened. Michaelis then put his hat on his head and then stood up to go. The others, one by one, followed him. And soon Mr. Verloc was closing the door to his shop behind them all. He was very disappointed in them. In fact, he was disgusted. Yunt, who was so old that he needed an old woman friend of his to care for him every day, was too weak. Michaelis, with his rich female friend giving him money all of the time, was a time-wasting dreamer. And Ossipon was nothing more than a chaser of young women. They were not the right men for the embassy job. He envied them, actually. They were all so lazy. And they could be lazy without any worries because they did not know Mr. Vladimir, and because, when it came to money, they all had women to take care of them. Mr. Verloc, however, had to take care of his woman. He had to make sure this job was done or he would lose everything. Putting the money drawer in his arms, he decided to go to bed. On his way to the staircase, he suddenly realized that Stevie had not yet gone to bed. He was running around the kitchen table, chasing an imaginary animal or something. Mr. Verloc watched the boy for a few moments, thinking, "This is another mouth that I must feed." He then walked upstairs. He passed his mother-in-law's room, and hearing her loud breathing, he thought, "Another stomach to fill." When he reached his bedroom, he woke up his wife and asked that she put her brother to bed. Without saying a word, she jumped out of bed and ran downstairs, shutting the door behind her. Mr. Verloc slowly dressed himself for bed. He was uncomfortable and nervous. Mr. Vladimir's face kept appearing and reappearing in his mind, reminding him that his job was now very unstable. He put his head against the window and suddenly became more aware than ever of London's ugliness all around. Then Winnie returned.
He's upset about something that he heard you and your friends discussing downstairs. He kept saying something about someone drinking another person's blood.
It was Carl Jung who said that, answered Mr. Verloc.
I don't like that man. He disgusts me. Michaelis, however, is quite a gentleman. Anyway, Stevie can't hear such things. He thinks it's real and gets terribly frightened. Why, just the other day, he read one of those stupid little letters Ossipon always asks us to sell for him. There was something in there about a police officer cutting off a man's ear. I don't remember exactly. It was awful. And poor Stevie was just crazy for the rest of the day and night. He's such a gentle person. He hates the idea of people hurting one another.
Mr. Verloc was not really listening to Winnie any longer. He was too worried about the moment when she would turn out the lights. The darkness of London would then surround him, and he would feel even more helpless than now.
Well, I'm tired. I suppose we should try to get some sleep,
she said.
Good night.
I've not been feeling well lately,
Mr. Verloc said, trying to prevent her from turning out the light.
You just need a good night's sleep,
she answered, turning off the light next to the bed. Yes, maybe you're right, he responded, knowing there would be no sleep for him this night. Chapter 4. Somewhere in London, Ossipon was sitting in a beer hall across the table from an ugly little man with large ears and a thick pair of glasses. The sound of loud piano music filled their ears, making conversation difficult. Ossipon, who was a very large and strong man, always felt very small and unimportant when he talked with this little fellow across from him. He often did not know what to say to the man, and would ask him stupid questions in order to fill the silence between them.
"Have you been here long?"
Ossipon asked. "About an hour," the man said, picking up his beer and taking a drink.
"I suppose that you haven't heard the news."
The man said that he had not heard. His face did not show any desire to hear the news either. Ossipon, who was quite excited about what he had just read in the newspapers, decided to try and cool his excitement in order not to look stupid in front of the man.
"Do you sell your bombs to anybody who wants them?"
he asked the little man. "Of course. I never refuse anybody."
"But isn't that a bit unsafe? I mean, what if the police were to send someone to buy something? You could easily get caught."
"The police and I have an understanding. They know that I will not allow myself to be arrested, and that I always have a bomb in my hands. If they were ever to try to catch me, they would die in the attempt. See?" He opened his coat and showed Ossipon the bomb he was carrying. "And if anyone were to try and surprise me, I would always be ready, because this button here never leaves my right hand. Never. All that I have to do is press it, and everyone within 60 meters of me will die. If I were to press it now, not a single person in this room would survive." Ossipon thought about this for a moment, and then asked,
"I suppose that the explosion happens immediately after you press the button?"
"Actually, no. It would explode 20 seconds later."
"My God, 20 seconds? How could you stand it? I would go crazy having to wait that long for my death to arrive."
"Yes, that's the main problem with this bomb. I want one day to perfect it, so that it will explode immediately. That is my one goal in life, my purpose." He then looked around the room with his cold eyes and said, "You see, what makes me so dangerous is the fact that I am outside of society. I have very little connection to it. You and your men, however, you are a part of society, whether you want to be or not. You are as much a part of society as the police are. You are trying to change things, and they are trying to prevent change. That's the only difference between you and them. Every decision that you make is influenced by your place in society, by your family, by your friends, by the police, by the government, and so on. I, however, live alone and work alone. All that I am concerned about is making the perfect bomb. I am the true revolutionary."
"Well, let's not discuss this any longer, Ossipon interrupted. I have some news to share with you. A man blew himself up in Greenwich Park today. This kind of behavior is going to make people like us look bad. I'm telling you this because I believe that you're giving your bombs to idiots who don't know how to use them.
The little man said nothing, but took another drink of his beer.
Ah, so it was you? Ossipon whispered angrily.
Yes, and I will continue to do so, the little man said without any feeling. I am a man of action, while you and your men do nothing but write meaningless words on paper.
And the man who died today, what about him?
He was a way for me to test my new bombs. I have to see if they work, after all.
Who was the man? What did he look like?
I can tell you exactly who he was.
Mr. Verloc.
Ossipon could not believe his ears.
Verloc? I saw him a month ago. He was quite a common man. Not at all a great thinker. Kept himself married. I guess that it was his woman's money that allowed him to pay for our letters. I wonder what will happen to her now. Did he tell you why he wanted the bomb?
He said it was meant to destroy a building, the little man said, getting the waiter's attention. That was all. I designed it so that the person would have 20 minutes to get away before it exploded. I guess that he must have forgotten about the time. He was now buttoning his coat to leave.
I'm worried, Ossipon said with an unhappy expression on his face. Verloc's dead. Karl Jung has become very ill. And Michaelis has disappeared into the countryside with his woman's money. What's happening to my organization? I have no money to keep it going.
If I were you, I would make every effort to tell the world that your organization had nothing to do with that idiot's death. And then I would visit Verloc's lonely wife. It seems she might be useful to you. Ossipon was surprised by this last piece of advice. A few minutes later, after the little man had already gone, Ossipon stood up, paid his bill, and entered the dark and filthy London night. Chapter 5. The little ugly man was known as the Professor, because he had once worked in a university laboratory. However, after a while, he had a bad argument with the leaders of his department, because he felt that they treated him poorly. He was fired. In fact, it would have been almost impossible for anyone to treat him the way he felt he should be treated. He thought that he was a genius and that he would one day rise to power. Whenever the smallest thing went against this idea, he would become terribly angry. In the end, he decided that it was necessary to teach society not to trust its laws and government. He believed with all of his cold heart that the best way to do this was through terrorism. The only thing he feared was that someday the people would no longer fear him. He turned down a dark and narrow street and saw a man at the other end walking toward him. It was Inspector Heat, one of the highest-ranking policemen in London. As they came closer to one another, the policeman suddenly stopped.
"It's not you I'm coming for," he said to the little man.
The professor looked at him with a feeling of power deep inside himself. This person in front of him represented everything that he was against. Their meeting was a pure accident. The chief inspector had been very active since 11 o'clock that morning, when the first news of the bombing in Greenwich Park came to him. He felt angry and embarrassed because he had promised his boss, just last week, that there was no need to worry about any terrorist activity happening soon. He said that he could make such a promise because all of his secret agents were closely watching all of the terrorists in London. Any plans made by the enemy would be easily discovered and prevented from happening. Earlier that morning, he had gone to the hospital to see the victim of the explosion. The doctors pulled back a couple of sheets and showed a pile of burned and bloodied body parts. It was hard to see that this pile had once been a person. The policeman who had been in the park at the time of the explosion was also there to tell his story. According to the officer, the morning was full of fog. While he was talking with a worker on the street, a bright light flashed nearby. "As you can see, the person cannot be identified. I had to search all over the park just to find every part of the body. An old woman in the park told me that she had seen a yellow-haired man walking with a large can in his arms. There was another man as well, but she didn't notice much about him, except that he was big. She said that the smaller man was wearing a dark blue coat with a collar made of velvet. You see here," he said, picking up a piece of cloth from the table. "Velvet, just like she said." The inspector grabbed the cloth from the officer, tore a piece of it off, placed it in his pocket, and then left the room. He then took a train to the center of town where his office was. He was still feeling sick to his stomach when, after getting off the train and walking for a bit, he ran into the professor in the street. He had not once thought about the professor that day. Instead, he had been thinking about how surprising human behavior could be. Earlier in his career, he was responsible for catching only thieves. While he did not agree with their occupation, he could understand their need to steal things. It made sense to him, and it might even be considered normal. However, the behavior of these terrorists was something he could not understand at all. And now he stood before one of them. "One day, however, I will come for you," he said to the professor. "And on that day you will die," replied the ugly little man. "Don't you worry that they might bury us together." The dark street suddenly seemed even darker to the inspector. "You don't frighten me with your threats. Don't worry. I'll catch you soon enough." "Why not catch me right now? There's no one around except for these two buildings on either side of us. Why not give your life now to save so many other lives later on?" "And lower myself to your level? No. Time will help the good guys to win the battle. You'll see." "The good guys? It seems that you don't understand why we do the things we do," observed the professor. "You're right about that. Why don't you tell me?" he said, obviously not really wanting to stay and listen, for he had other more important things to do. The professor only smiled. This gave the inspector more strength for some reason, and he spoke again. "There are many more police than there are terrorists like you. You'll never win. Besides, your men always seem to make too many mistakes. It's hopeless for you." The professor's smile suddenly disappeared as he became more and more aware of his loneliness and weakness, his powerlessness against the huge number of people out in the world against him. He could never make enough bombs to kill them all. The two men separated and continued in opposite directions down the little street. The little ugly man felt sad and a little helpless, while the inspector felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that he was the good guy and that most of the people in the world would be on his side. He even thought that the thieves might agree with him in his fight against the terrorists. Again, the problems of dealing with these terrorists came to his mind. They were so different from the thieves he was used to hunting. There were no rules with these crazy terrorists. Neither the police nor the terrorists could understand one another's thinking, and for this reason, he did not respect the terrorists. They had no system, no real identifiable organization. It was simply madness. When he arrived at his boss's office, he found the assistant commissioner bent over a large pile of papers in the middle of his desk.
"It seems that this bomb was not the work of your terrorists after all," commented the assistant commissioner. "Our agents reported that none of their men were responsible. However, because we haven't identified the bomber yet, the people of London must think of us as disorganized idiots. What have you found out this morning?"
The inspector told him about the two men the woman had seen. One of them, he explained, the bigger one, had left the other in the park to finish the job on his own. The assistant commissioner listened quietly and carefully. He did not like the complications of his job very much. He liked handling things himself, not leaving the work to a bunch of unreliable officers. And he was always very sensitive to the way the people of London felt about the police force and about him.
"This is terrible. Absolutely terrible. This has been going on for the past 2 weeks,"
he shouted while looking out of his office window. Rain was coming down hard outside.
"Have you sent men to find the other man?"
"Of course, sir. The two men seem to have come from the Maze Hill station. The ticket man said that he had seen two men together that morning, and that they both looked like workers, but higher-level workers. He said that the bigger man came out of the train holding the metal can first. Then he handed the can to his partner and led him to the park area before walking away. All of this totally agrees with what the woman said. I also saw pieces of metal among the parts of the body of the dead man this morning."
"Don't you find it strange that this kind of job would have required 2 men? It doesn't make sense."
"But it makes more sense when you know that Michaelis is living in a small house in the same area," the inspector answered. The assistant commissioner was surprised to hear this name thrown into the conversation, and his eagerness to find the people responsible for the latest bombing suddenly became much greater. Chapter 6. Michaelis's wealthy friend was actually considered a great woman among society. She was also a friend of the assistant commissioner's wife. Now quite old, she had lived most of her life among the rich and powerful. She felt comfortable with her position in society, and this allowed her to share her rather strong opinions about the world with anyone. She was so intelligent and so sure of herself, almost everyone who knew her admired her. She often had parties at her home and would invite anyone who seemed to her above normal society, whether by money, power, intelligence, or talent. This allowed her to keep an eye on the direction in which the world was moving at any given time. Sometimes this even meant allowing criminals into her home. Criminals like Michaelis, for example. Michaelis had been hated by most of society just before going to prison. He had been involved in a plan to release 2 criminals from a police car. The plan went badly, and one of the guards was killed. The guard had a wife and 3 children at the time, and all of society felt terribly sorry for the family. The criminals involved in the plan quickly became the most hated people in all of England. Most of them were killed, but Michaelis, whose role in the crime was only to unlock the door of the car, was sent to prison instead. He was sent there to stay for the rest of his life, because in the courtroom he had said, "Although I am sad about the death of the police officer, I am also disappointed that we didn't succeed in our plan." Later on, some powerful people, for reasons still unknown, made a strong argument for Michaelis to be freed from prison. He himself had nothing to do with it. He was released, but under the very watchful eyes of the police force. In reality, Michaelis was not what most people would call a great thinker, but he had done a lot of thinking in prison. And from all of this thought came the conclusion that society was going to improve itself in the future. He believed in the natural good of the people. Being a bit shy and even a little like a child, he always avoided the eyes of others when sharing the ideas he had developed in prison. This made him seem charming to others, including the great woman who is now sharing a bit of her wealth with him. His first appearance in society after being released from prison was at this woman's party, and he did very well. The assistant commissioner had been there and had even heard the conversation that Michaelis had with the old woman. It was the first time they had met. It was obvious that she pitied the fat man and also found him charming in his shy but friendly manner. After Michaelis had left the party, the old woman sat quietly for a few moments and then, turning to the assistant commissioner, said,
"I can't believe you think he's dangerous."
"Not dangerous, maybe, but a man who wants revolution," he had answered.
They put him away for 20 years because of his beliefs. That is a crime against him. Now he has nothing and no one. Obviously, the poor man needs someone to care for him. He cannot do it himself.
The whole room began to agree with her. Even the assistant commissioner agreed, although he did not say this to anyone. So, when he heard the chief inspector mention Michaelis, he became uncomfortable. He knew that the old lady would not sit quietly and allow the man's freedom to be threatened. He also knew that the unhealthy man would never live through another trial and prison term. It would certainly kill him. The old woman would blame the assistant commissioner. She would begin to hate him. This idea upset him for several reasons. He liked going to her parties and felt that the people there liked him as well. He also respected the woman and felt that she was truly one of the kindest people he had ever known. And lastly, she was a very good influence on his wife, who, without the old woman's friendship and advice, would have made their marriage a terrible one.
"So, you think Michaelis is somehow connected to this bombing?"
the assistant commissioner asked with his back to the inspector.
"I'm pretty sure of it, sir,"
Inspector Heat answered.
"I'd certainly have no trouble finding information to prove it."
He then laughed a little in order to show his boss just how easy it would be. The assistant commissioner felt a sudden rise of anger within himself. He turned around very quickly to face the inspector. He did not trust the inspector to do his work honestly. He felt that the man might make up a lie against Michaelis and build up false proof around it. He could not help but think this, because he was a true detective. It was quite natural for him to mistrust others and question their actions.
"What kind of tricks are you planning here?"
"Sir, I don't know what you mean."
"I mean that if you really thought Michaelis was involved, you would have sent some of your men out to his home to investigate. But you haven't, have you?" "Do you think I'm doing my job incorrectly, sir?" asked the inspector. "No, that's not what I'm saying. He just happens to live 3 miles from the train station the 2 bombers were reported to have come from. I think that it's enough to show his guilt, sir." The inspector respected the assistant commissioner, but he found him to be a little strange. He was certainly very different from the 2 assistant commissioners he had served before. After 18 months, he was still a mystery to the inspector. "Do you know what he's been doing since he moved to the countryside, Inspector? Exactly, I mean." The assistant commissioner himself knew that Michaelis spent almost all of his time sitting in a small house writing a book about his time in prison and the ideas that came to him there. "I should have a detailed report within the next 3 hours," answered the inspector. He could not understand why the assistant commissioner was behaving this way. It was normal and perfectly legal to arrest Michaelis and question him. His involvement in revolutionary meetings was very well known. Of course, he also knew that Michaelis's involvement was probably not very deep. In fact, there were plenty of other criminals who were much guiltier than this man. However, they were much more difficult to catch and prove guilty. Michaelis was easy to catch and well known among the people. "But why did you not think of Michaelis until you entered my office?" the assistant commissioner asked. "Well, if there weren't enough proof, I suppose I wouldn't send my men out there," the inspector said, still confused by his boss's behavior. "Exactly. Not enough proof. Now, leave it at that. Do you understand?" The inspector was proud of the honest work that he did. He did not like what he was being asked to do, and he was not afraid of the assistant commissioner. "You'll not be in this job for very long," he wanted to say to his boss. "Now, tell me what facts you have found about this case," the assistant commissioner said, changing the subject. "I found this cloth this morning at the hospital," the inspector said, pulling out a piece of cloth from his pocket. "It belonged to the dead bomber. You can see that there's an address written on it." "Why in the world would he have his address written on his clothing?" asked the assistant commissioner. "Some people do it in case they have an accident and people can't identify them. Some old people do it in case they lose their memory and get lost." "Well, what's at this address?" "A store, sir. It belongs to a man named Verloc. He works as a spy for the embassy." "And why don't I know about him?" "No one really knows except for me, sir. A friend of mine told me about him. Since then, it has been my own little secret. Anyway, I met Mr. Verloc around 7 years ago when the ambassador at the time, Baron Stott-Wartenheim called me over to his office and had this fat man tell me a surprising piece of information. It was information about some visiting French government officials who were going to the opera that evening. When I turned to talk with the Baron for a moment, he quietly ran out of the room. I used the information that he gave me, and it turned out to be quite true. It prevented a major event from happening. A month or so later, I visited Paris and met a friend of mine who worked for the police. I described Verloc to him, and he said that they believed he might be a spy for one of the embassies in London. He then got every file he had on Mr. Verloc and gave it to me. When I returned to London, I visited him at his store and told him who I was. We then made a deal that I would not report his illegal business to the police if he would stay out of trouble and occasionally provide me with information about the revolutionists. Generally, he was someone I felt that I could trust to give me good information. So, is this man being watched by us? Not really. I don't think that he has much to do with this bombing. I think that Michaelis is the man we want. And the man who ran away before the bomb exploded? I guess that he's probably far away from London now. The assistant commissioner made up his mind suddenly. He told the inspector to return to his office in the morning with further reports about the investigation. He, being a detective at heart, felt like doing a bit of detective work himself, instead of sitting in his office and sorting through papers. After the inspector had left the office for home, the assistant commissioner soon followed. Chapter 7. The assistant commissioner walked through the dirty streets of London to get to the office of a high-level government official. The great man's personal secretary greeted him as he entered. "May I see him?" asked the assistant commissioner. "Well, he's about to leave just now," answered the secretary. "It's important. It has to do with the bombing in Greenwich Park." "Really? He's quite upset with you and your men about that. Let me go ask if he has time to meet you." Moments later, the secretary opened the door and gestured for him to enter the great man's office. When he did, he found the man standing in this very large room with his hat and gloves on the table next to him, as if ready to go out. He was a big man, and his clothing looked as though it might tear open at any moment. He did not say hello to the assistant commissioner. "I want to know if there are going to be many more bombings after this one," he said directly. "Just give me a direct answer. I haven't time to chat." The assistant commissioner looked like a little child compared to the huge man. "No," he answered. "I don't think so." I seem to remember you standing in this same room a month ago, telling me that it would be impossible for bombings to happen." "That was not me, Sir Ethelred," corrected the assistant commissioner. "Oh, yes, you're right. That was Inspector Heat. You were too new to have any useful information. So, how are things for you over there?" "Good, sir. I have come to tell you about something I just learned today about this case. It was not a common bombing. There is something strange about it." He then told the great man everything that he knew. Sir Ethelred stood silently and listened.
The assistant commissioner delivered his news with great skill and power. When he finished telling, Sir Ethelred spoke in a very serious voice.
"A foreign embassy? That is quite unusual. How dare these foreigners come into our country and cause such problems? Something must be done about this immediately. What do you suggest?" "I came to you today because I think that this is a special case that needs to be dealt with in a quiet way."
"Quite right. Go on."
"In my opinion, Inspector Heat should be removed from—"
"Ah, yes, Heat. What a fool!"
"No, sir. I don't mean that at all. He's quite good at what he does. However, being a police officer for so long, he uses certain methods that I don't really agree with. For instance, he has been in contact with the person I just told you about for almost 7 years. He told me so today. However, before today, he had never told anyone else about this connection. I feel that this kind of information should be shared with the department, not kept hidden. 1 month ago, he promised you that there would be no revolutionary activity, and he was probably correct in telling you this. However, a bombing has now occurred. His way of doing things allows for great error, I'm afraid."
The great Sir Ethelred leaned back in thought. Indeed.
"What I'm asking, sir, is for your permission to allow me to investigate this case in my own way without Inspector Heat. I would like to visit Mr. Verloc myself and deal with him directly. I don't know exactly how he was involved in the bombing, but I'm sure that he knows something. The bomber was led to the park by another man and then left to finish the job on his own. We think that the dead man had no idea that he was holding a bomb. Maybe he was a foreigner who couldn't speak English. We're not exactly sure."
"Fine. Deal with the case in whatever way you feel is best."
"Thank you, sir. I shall begin tonight, then."
"Very good. Are you going to change your appearance so that people won't recognize you?" asked the great man.
"I'm going to change my clothes, sir. Nothing more."
Come back here later this evening. You can tell me what you've discovered. I'm most curious. Of course, I won't have time, but I'll see you anyway. I'll tell Toodles that you'll be coming."
"Fine, sir."
Toodles was the name given to the great man's young personal secretary. The boy's family knew many important people, and he believed that he would one day become an important person himself. However, for now, he would simply be known as Toodles, the pet of a great man. Then the assistant commissioner left Sir Ethelred's office feeling quite happy with himself. Toodles asked him how the meeting went.
"Very well. Thank you for arranging it for me." "I'm just surprised that he had the time to see you.
He's so busy, you know."
"We stay here so late sometimes. Of course, it doesn't bother me at all. Do you think we're safe walking out in the streets? Do you think one of those revolutionists might throw a bomb at us?"
"I'm sure that it's safe. Don't worry." Then a small bell rang in the great man's room.
"Oh, that's him," Toodles whispered. "I think he's ready to go."
And then he ran off to gather Sir Ethelred's coat. The assistant commissioner then headed directly to his own office. When he arrived, he looked around carefully to see if Inspector Heat was still around. He found out from the guard that the inspector had left around a half an hour before. In his office, he was disappointed to see that the inspector had taken the piece of cloth. There was no reason for him to think that the inspector did not trust him. An important piece of evidence, like that cloth, should not be left sitting on a table. He fought back his anger at the inspector and sent a note to his wife to politely cancel their plans to have dinner that evening with the lady who supported Michaelis. He put on a small jacket and a casual hat, and, after looking at himself in the mirror, went out into the streets. The road, the buildings, and the lights were all wet. He, in his casual clothing, was very much like all of the rest of the people on the street. No one would have guessed that he was the assistant commissioner of police. Trying to keep himself unnoticed by anyone, he waited until the very last second, as a taxi was passing him, to jump aboard and tell the driver where to go. A few minutes later, he asked the driver to stop in front of a curtain store. Most of the shops on the street were closed for the evening. A hand came through the door and gave the driver some money, followed by the sound of the door on the other side opening and closing. The driver had never once seen who his customer was. The assistant commissioner then entered a cheap Italian restaurant. He had a quick dinner, and as he was getting up to leave, he caught sight of himself in a mirror. He was surprised at how much he looked like a foreigner. He was happy with his appearance. It gave him the feeling of being very lonely and free. He looked about the room before exiting the building. Many of the customers looked like they ate there often. The food at this place not being real Italian food, he felt that these people were equally not really British. They had lost their nationality and even their personality somehow. And now, he too had lost his. No one could possibly guess who he truly was. Mr. Verloc's street was just around the corner. The assistant commissioner stood in the shadows and took a good look at the area. It was normally a street full of shops, but now everything was closed for the evening, except for a fruit cellar. People passed one another in the darkness and then disappeared forever. The excitement of adventure was within him. He felt very far away from his office with all of its boring paperwork. At times, he even felt like a criminal hiding in the darkness. A light was on inside Mr. Verloc's shop. The assistant commissioner then crossed the street and headed toward the building. Chapter 8. Mrs. Verloc's mother soon became a member of a home for old people. She did not tell her daughter that she was planning to move, but had been secretly investigating such places for the past week. And now she had found one. Mrs. Verloc had noticed that her mother was going out quite often and spending a lot of money on taxi services. She mentioned this to her husband, but he seemed too lost in his own thoughts to really care. When her mother finally told her the news, Winnie was very surprised and upset.
"Why do you want to move?"
she asked.
"Don't we take good care of you here?"
Winnie, who had been cleaning when told the news, returned to her work and waited for her mother's answer. Her mother, however, remained silent. She did not know what to say.
"Well, can you at least tell me how you found the place?"
Winnie then asked. Her mother then explained with excitement that she had talked with several of her dead husband's friends who were also hotel owners. They all agreed to put some of their money toward opening a home for old people to live in. She then told her daughter that she would be taking some of the furniture with her. Out of kindness, she only chose the least attractive things to take with her. She thought about giving the rest of her things to her son Stevie, who had nothing in the world. But then she thought that Mr. Verloc might not be comfortable using furniture that was his brother-in-law's. This might cause problems in the future that might lead to Mr. Verloc asking Stevie to move out. Stevie's mother was terrified of such a possibility. Where would her son go? What could he do? No, the furniture would be a gift to her daughter then. That would be the safest thing to do. The next day, when the time came for the old woman to leave, she called for a taxi. The carriage that arrived to take her away was in terrible condition, and so was its driver. He had no right hand and looked like he had not showered in days. The old woman looked at her daughter, wondering if it was safe to take the taxi.
"What's wrong, madam?"
the driver asked.
"Do you think I can't drive this taxi?"
Then a policeman walked up to them. He greeted the driver with a smile, as if he knew him well.
"Don't worry, ma'am," he said. "This man's a very good driver. He's never had an accident in the 20 years he's been working."
This satisfied the woman and her daughter. They both got inside the taxi, and Stevie jumped up onto the driver's seat, next to the poor old man. As the taxi drove slowly through the city, Winnie noticed the poor condition of the horse that was pulling them. Stevie had also noticed and yelled at the driver in short, simple sentences not to hit the horse with his whip. The driver, however, did not stop whipping his horse because he needed to do it to make the horse keep moving.
"Stop!" shouted Stevie. "It's bad."
He then jumped down from the driver's seat as they were crossing a bridge. People on the street began shouting, for the taxi had to stop suddenly. Winnie put her head outside of the window to see what was happening. Her mother began to worry that Stevie had been injured. Then Stevie ran to them, shouting,
"We walk! Carriage too heavy! We walk!"
He was too excited to speak clearly. His sister did not agree to walk.
"No, Stevie, get back on the taxi." "Don't let him walk, Winnie,"
ordered the mother.
"He'll wander away, and we won't be able to find him." "Of course I won't let him walk,"
answered Winnie.
"Stevie, get on the taxi now. Mr. Verloc will be very disappointed to hear how you've behaved today."
Stevie, not wanting to make his brother-in-law angry, obeyed his sister's command and got back onto the driver's seat, but with a sad feeling in his heart.
"Don't you do that again, young man," said the driver.
The emotions inside the taxi were now quite different from before.
"I think you're making a big mistake, Mother,"
Winnie announced.
"It's embarrassing that you should leave our home to go to such a place. It looks as if we haven't been good to you." "Oh, don't be silly. You've been a wonderful daughter. And your husband."
The old woman began to get tears in her eyes. She stopped talking and turned her head toward the window. It was true. This move would look bad to people. They would think that Winnie and her husband had cruelly forced the old woman to leave their home. Or they would simply think that the daughter did not care for her mother enough in her old age. Either way, it would look quite bad. However, Mrs. Verloc's mother knew that she was an extra mouth to feed. She knew that she took up space in that small house of theirs. And she knew that Mr. Verloc would get increasingly tired of having his wife's family around. By moving out, she might be able to make it easier for Mr. Verloc to accept Stevie living in his home. When her dead husband's friends asked the old woman why she wanted to move, she chose to lie. She feared that they would not let her move in if they knew she had a good daughter. So, by lowering her eyes and not saying anything, she made the men think that her situation at home was a bad one. She felt guilty about lying, but she felt that in the end it would make things better for everyone. What she was doing seemed like cruelty on the surface, but in reality she was being quite heroic. She was saving her son. When the taxi finally stopped in front of Mrs. Verloc's mother's new home, the old woman turned to her daughter before getting out.
Now, you come see me often, and have Stevie visit me every Sunday. I don't think he'll have a problem with doing that. Are you joking?
Shouted Winnie.
He's going to miss you terribly. Maybe you should have thought of that before making such a terrible decision.
The old woman said nothing in return. As she opened the door and slowly let herself out of the carriage, a new thought came to her.
Do you think Stevie will be able to come here on his own?
She asked.
He'd have to change 2 buses and do some more walking afterward. Oh, I'm afraid he'd get lost. What if he forgets his address?
Then she started to cry loudly. She hated the idea of not seeing her son.
It's all right, Mother. I'll make sure that he doesn't get lost. You'll see him often, I promise.
It had grown dark during their ride to the old people's home. Stevie was now standing under a gas lamp waiting for the 2 women to finish talking. The driver of the taxi looked down at the boy from his seat.
Now listen to me, young man. Can you imagine driving this carriage until 2 o'clock in the morning? Sometimes 3 or even 4 o'clock every day?
Stevie did not respond. He just stared back at the driver's tired red eyes.
This horse is strong, I tell you. He's taken care of, see? Can you imagine all those hours, boy? Looking for customers just so I can get something to eat or drink? Most of the time I find only people who've been out drinking too much.
The driver told the boy about all of his problems, about the life of a late-night taximan.
Life's hard for me and my family. I've 4 children and a wife to feed. It's a hard world. I tell you, a very hard world.
Stevie pitied both the man and his horse. He wished that he could somehow make them happy. He even got the crazy idea of taking them home with him. But, of course, he knew he could not do that. He wanted to let both the man and the horse sleep with him that night, just like his sister used to let him do when he was having a bad day. The driver then crawled down from his seat and, taking the reins in his hands, whispered to his horse, "Let's go." They moved slowly across the unseen stones of the street. It seemed that they were headed for a drinking house about 50 meters down the block. Stevie felt horrible. He squeezed his hands into fists inside his pockets. Because he could not help the taxi man and his horse, his sadness was turning into anger. His sister was not aware of all that he was currently feeling. She could see that he was excited, but she did not know the reason why, nor did she try to understand. Instead, She tried making him feel like she needed his help getting back home.
All right, Stevie, it's time for us to go now. Please, help me to cross the street safely and get to our bus.
Stevie immediately stood up straight and offered his arm to Winnie.
"Don't worry, Winnie," he said. "I can get us there safe, no problem."
As they walked home under the soft lights of the gas lamps, they passed the same taxi driver on the street. Seeing how awful the horse looked, Winnie could not help feeling sad for the horse.
I feel so sorry for him,
she said aloud. Stevie answered her with all the emotion he had inside of himself. "Yes, sad. And the taxi driver also. He's sad. He told me." Stevie wanted to say more, but could not. He felt much more than he could express. He tried to say more, but all that would come out of his mouth was the word shame. It hurt him to see the taxi driver hitting his horse just so he could feed his family. It hurt him more than others because he was familiar with being beaten. His father had always beaten him terribly. With that horrible memory in his mind, as well as the sadness he saw on the streets of London, Stevie felt that the whole world was a very terrible place. His sister, who did not like to question things, could not see what was happening inside of her brother. She did not really know the true meaning of the word shame. She just pulled her brother along after her, saying,
"Let's go, Stevie. There's nothing we can do about it."
He followed her, but he busied himself trying to find the right words to express what he felt. Finally, after going through all the words he could remember, he managed to say,
"Terrible life for people with no money."
Winnie, seeing that her brother was getting even more excited than before, tried calming him down again.
"It can't be helped. Now, come and help your sister to get back home."
He did what she told him to do, but he continued to think about the problems of the world. He was not satisfied with his sister's answer. Then he suddenly stopped again, and with a smile on his face, he said,
"The police. They can help."
"No, Stevie, that's not their job,"
answered Winnie. Her brother's smile suddenly disappeared, replaced by a confused look.
"Not their job,"
he said, his mouth hanging open.
"What is their job?"
His idea of the police was that they stopped all kinds of bad things from happening. He loved police officers and saw them all as being very good people. He trusted them completely. And now his sister's words were going against all that he had believed. Becoming full of anger, he asked,
"What do they do then?"
Winnie, being the wife of a man who was friends and partners with all kinds of people against the government, answered him appropriately.
"The police protect the people who have things from the people who have nothing."
"But what if the people who have nothing want to eat? Won't the police help them?"
Stevie asked.
"No, that's not their job. It doesn't matter anyway. You won't ever be without food, so we needn't talk about it."
Stevie was the only thing in the world that Mrs. Verloc had any real feelings for. Looking at him now, he seemed friendly, caring, even handsome, and only a little strange. In her mind, it was impossible for anyone to dislike her brother.
"Oh, Stevie, That green bus is the one we want. Let's catch it."
1 hour later, they arrived back at their home and found Mr. Verloc holding a newspaper in front of his face in the store. He was happy to see his wife, but he still did not say anything to her. As for Stevie, he did not even notice him. Mr. Verloc was so lost in his own thoughts about what he had to do that he hardly ever spoke at home any more. Whether in his shop, in the card-playing room, lying in bed, or sitting at the kitchen table for dinner, he never spoke a word to anyone. The silence made Winnie miss her mother even more than she normally would have. Her awareness of being lonely grew more and more. However, still neither she nor Stevie attempted to speak to Mr. Verloc. His mother and sister had taught Stevie that his brother-in-law was a good man. His father had been horrible to him, and the men who came to stay at his mother's hotel were always coming and going so quickly. Mr. Verloc, however, never hurt the boy, and was always around the home. Therefore, he believed in what his mother and sister had told him about Mr. Verloc. And he now completely trusted him and never wanted to anger or upset him. Looking at his brother-in-law's sad face at the dinner table, he began to feel sad as well.
"Are you going anywhere this evening?"
Winnie asked her husband. He only shook his head and silently stared at the dinner plate before him. Then, only a minute later, he got up from the table and walked directly through the front door of the shop. Feeling so troubled inside, he could not control himself. He felt the need to get away from everyone, to be alone. But minutes later, he returned home and sat down behind the shop counter. Later that evening, while lying in bed, Winnie spoke to Mr. Verloc about her mother.
"I can't believe that she left us like that. It's horrible."
Mr. Verloc could not help thinking that maybe his mother-in-law had realized the trouble that he also felt was fast approaching. Maybe she wanted to get out before the difficulties began. However, he did not say this to his wife. Instead, he simply said, "Maybe it's best that she moved." For a moment, Winnie felt upset by Mr. Verloc's words. For the best? How was it for the best? But then, not usually one to think too much about anything, she decided to let it go and change the subject to her brother.
"How I'm going to keep Stevie from being so sad, I have no idea. He's such a wonderful person. I can't imagine ever being away from him."
Mr. Verloc said nothing more. His thoughts never once left his troubles. He wanted more than anything at that moment to tell his wife everything. But looking at her, lying there with her head against the pillow and her soft, big black eyes staring at him, he thought about how much he loved the fact that she was his. It was like a pet or a valuable vase that he'd never use. He chose not to upset her. "I'm going away for a week or two," he growled. "You should ask Mrs. Neal to come and help you care for Stevie while I'm away." This news did not come as a big surprise to Mrs. Verloc. Her husband often went abroad for several weeks at a time. She did not even bother to ask him why he was leaving.
"I can take care of Stevie on my own,"
she answered.
"Shall I turn the light off?"
"Turn it off," Mr. Verloc responded coldly. Chapter 9. Mr. Verloc was gone for 10 days. When he came back, he did not seem any happier than before. He looked tired and sad. Throwing himself into a chair and dropping his bags on the floor, He said, "Here," to Stevie, who was busy cleaning the shop window. The young man immediately smiled and ran to pick up Mr. Verloc's travel bags and put them away for him. Mr. Verloc was surprised by the boy's eagerness. Hearing her husband's entrance, Winnie appeared in the kitchen doorway and, without saying hello, offered him some breakfast. Mr. Verloc, by throwing both of his hands up in the air and letting them fall, acted as though his wife were the most troublesome person in the world. However, he managed to pick himself up out of the chair and walk to the kitchen. At the dinner table, Mrs. Verloc told her husband all the news that there was to tell.
Several of your friends came to the house while you were away. Michaelis told me that he's moving into a small house in the countryside, just outside of London, near Dover. That horrible man, Carl Yunt, came with that equally horrible woman of his. Oh, and Ossipon visited as well.
Here she stopped, speaking for a moment, and her face turned slightly red, but Mr. Verloc did not notice.
Stevie's been very sad, although that hasn't stopped him from working around the house. He's been a great help to Mrs. Neal and me.
Mr. Verloc took his hat off, and Stevie immediately got up from his chair and hung the hat on the wall in the next room. As he was coming back, he passed Mrs. Neal, who was working hard at cleaning the floor.
"Oh!"
she cried as if in pain.
"Such hard work. You're lucky not to have to work like me. You have only yourself to worry about and feed."
Winnie, hearing this, told Mr. Verloc that Mrs. Neal had been saying such things to Stevie all week. She knew how emotional he was, and that he would always give her the money he had in his pockets any time that he heard her complain about her difficulties. Then the sound of Stevie hitting his hand against the table in the next room could be heard. He was upset because he had nothing to give the poor woman.
"Come here, Stevie,"
she called to her brother. She did not like giving the woman extra money because she knew the woman would spend it getting drunk down the street. Later that day, as Mr. Verloc announced that he was going outside to take a walk, Winnie suggested that he take her brother with him.
"He needs the air. And if he has nothing to do, he always feels terrible. I can't be comfortable with him, looking so sad all the time."
"But what if I lose him somehow?" Mr. Verloc argued.
"Oh, you don't have to worry about that. He'd never leave your side. You're such an important person in his life. He respects you more than anyone else. Besides, if he were to wander away, it would be fine. Because—"
She stopped for a brief moment and then continued,
"Never mind, he'll be fine. Trust me."
Mr. Verloc was surprised by his wife's trust in Stevie to find his way back home. Perhaps the boy was more intelligent than he thought.
"All right, he can come with me,"
he finally agreed. Watching the two men walking down the street together, Winnie felt happy for a moment. In her eyes, it looked as if it could be a tall, round father walking with his shorter and much thinner son. She began to feel proud of herself for having found such a good living situation for her brother. He would be safe here. Although it was not the ideal situation for herself, it was worth accepting for her brother. Over the next few days, Winnie became even more pleased to see her husband taking greater interest in Stevie. He always invited him to join him on his walks about town. And on several occasions, Winnie noticed Mr. Verloc studying the boy with his eyes. He was a different man, her husband. His moods were not as dark as before, and he no longer moved so slowly about the home. Stevie had changed a little too. Instead of sitting sadly in the corner when he had nothing to do, he would walk about talking to himself in a rather serious voice. He seemed troubled about something. When Winnie tried asking him what was the matter, he would only stare at her with an open mouth. Mrs. Verloc then began to worry about the walks her brother was taking with her husband. She knew that Mr. Verloc almost always met one of his friends on the street and that there would be revolutionary talk. Remembering how upset Stevie had become after the last meeting in their basement, she wondered if Stevie was hearing too many violent ideas. When she mentioned this to Mr. Verloc, he did not respond right away, but took down a package from a shelf in the shop. Gently laying it on the counter, he then said, "I've got an idea. Why don't we send Stevie to stay out at Michaelis's cottage? The old man is working on a book just outside of London." Winnie liked the idea because she liked Michaelis. Karl Yunt she hated. And Ossipon, well, she had nothing to say about him.
"You seem to like Stevie so much more lately,"
she observed. Mr. Verloc tied a string tightly around the package and then looked up into his wife's smiling face and said, "I'll take him out there myself tomorrow morning." The next day Stevie was happy to go with his brother-in-law, and he felt proud to carry the package that was put into his hands. He seemed almost embarrassed when his sister reminded him not to get dirty out in the countryside. He gave her a look that said, "Give me a chance to be an adult, will you?" And she, surprised and touched by this, apologized and wished him a wonderful trip. On the day of the bombing, Winnie was left alone at home much longer than usual. Mr. Verloc came home later than expected, but she did not think much of it. She did not raise her eyes from the sweater she was sewing when she heard the familiar steps of her husband come through the front door of the shop. Without once looking at him, she asked,
"Terrible day out there, yes? Did you visit Stevie today?"
"No, I didn't," her husband said quietly. Mr. Verloc walked past her and into the house, closing the door very loudly behind him. This did not trouble her either, because she was used to being treated coldly in her home. She accepted this as just being her husband's way of doing things. She still thought of him as a very good man. Putting her sewing down and going into the kitchen to take Mr. Verloc a cup of tea, she stopped in the doorway. The sound of something shaking came to her ears, and she quickly lit the lamp to see what it was. She found her husband bent over the stove, his large body shaking with cold.
"My goodness, you've caught a terrible cold. Where did you go today?"
"To the bank," he answered in a low, painful voice.
"Why the bank?"
she asked. Mr. Verloc seemed to be using all of his strength to answer her. "Took the money out."
"All the money?"
"That's right." Beginning to prepare the kitchen table for a meal, she continued to ask questions.
"Why did you do that?"
"We might be needing it soon."
"I guess that I don't really understand,"
she said, trying not to seem worried.
"I'm an honest man, right?" Mr. Verloc asked.
"Of course. Yes, of course."
"You'll have to trust me."
Thinking to herself,
"I bet he hasn't eaten all day."
She pulled some meat and bread from the shelf. Then, after placing 2 plates on the dinner table, she began to speak again.
I would never have married you if I didn't believe you were honest.
Mr. Verloc held his face in his hands in front of the fire. He ignored his wife's suggestion that he eat. However, he sat down at the kitchen table. He looked terribly ill. His hair was going in all directions, and his face and eyes looked as though they were on fire. He did not touch the food in front of him, but threw 3 cups of tea down his throat, one after another.
Well, let's at least dry your feet. They must be freezing,
she suggested.
I don't care about my feet. Leave them alone, he whispered violently.
Are you going out again this evening?
Hearing this question, Mr. Verloc's eyes suddenly became wide. Going out? Yes, in a way. That was what he was thinking of doing.
I'm thinking of leaving the country. I don't know where yet. Maybe France. Maybe America, he said.
What? Are you joking?
Mrs. Verloc shouted.
I can't stand this place any longer.
You're just ill now,
she interrupted him. It was true that he did not seem his normal self at all. He remained quiet for a short time, but then he said,
We have no choice. We must leave.
How can you say such a thing? You have everything you need here. This house, the shop. Why would you want to throw all of this away?
Then, walking over to where he was sitting, she put her arms around his shoulders and kissed the top of his head, asking,
Do you want to leave me, too?
She let her lips rest on his forehead for quite a long time. At that moment, the house seemed completely quiet. The only sound that could be heard was of the gas feeding the fire in the lamp. Mr. Verloc took a strong hold of the seat of his chair until she finished with her kiss. Then he got up from his seat and walked over to the fireplace. From there he stood watching his wife with a very sad and hopeless look. She, however, cleaned up around the kitchen without any worries.
No way. Stevie could never be taken abroad. I wouldn't allow it,
she said, changing her voice to a serious tone. And because her husband did not answer her, she found enough courage to go even further.
If you go abroad, you'll just have to go alone.
I won't do that, and you know it,
Mr. Verloc answered with rare emotion. Mrs. Verloc suddenly felt sorry about what she had said. It certainly was not true. She would have gone with him, of course. However, she disagreed so much with his plan that she felt the need to say something strong. In order to make things better, she turned to her husband and said,
That's right. You would be very unhappy without me. Admit it.
Yes, he answered, beginning to walk toward her with his arms stretched out. It was difficult to know whether he meant to hug her or kiss her. Then the doorbell of the shop suddenly rang.
Could you see who it is, Adolphe?
She asked.
I have my kitchen clothing on.
He let his arms fall to his sides and then, without saying a word, slowly walked out of the kitchen. Mrs. Verloc then began to wash the dishes, occasionally stopping to try and hear who it was that had come in. When not a sound could be heard, she quietly began to walk toward the door of the shop. Then Mr. Verloc came back through the door. His face was terribly white. He looked extremely troubled.
"What's wrong?"
she said, looking through the shop door and noticing that the customer was still inside. "It seems that I'm going to have to go out tonight," Mr. Verloc answered. Winnie then immediately entered the shop and closed the door behind her. She wanted to see whom it was that was waiting there. Her face remained calm and friendly.
"Hello, are you a foreigner?"
she asked the man. His clothing and the hair on his face made it obvious that he was not an Englishman. He only answered her with a smile.
"Do you speak English?"
she asked him. "Yes, of course," he responded in slow but perfect English.
"Oh, well, don't worry. My husband will find you an excellent place to stay. The Continental Hotel is quite nice."
"That would be lovely," he said, suddenly looking a little more serious.
"Have you known my husband a long time? Did you perhaps meet in France?"
"I have only heard his name before." A look of worry then came over the man. "Is it possible that he might have gone out another door to meet me outside?"
"Oh, no. This is the only door to our home. Just a moment. I'll see what he's doing."
Winnie went back into her home and closed the door behind her. Her husband was still standing where she had left him. His eyes were staring at the ground.
"Who is that man?"
she asked. "I've only heard his name before," he said, lifting his eyes to meet hers for a moment. "This is my first time meeting him."
"Is he from the embassy?"
Mr. Verloc's eyes suddenly became wide with surprise. "What do you mean? Who told you about the embassy?"
"No one. You've been talking in your sleep lately."
"Talking in my sleep?" he whispered loudly. "What did you hear?"
I couldn't really understand. It all sounded kind of silly, really. It didn't make much sense."
Mr. Verloc's face turned bright red. He walked about the room talking to himself in a quiet but angry whisper. "I'd love to kill all of those damned embassy people. All of them. If I can't kill them, I can surely use what I know against them." Then, as his anger turned back into fear, his face turned very white again. He walked back into the shop without saying another word to Winnie.
"Adolf, wait a moment,"
she whispered. He came back, looking more frightened than before.
"Is the money you took from the bank still in your pocket?"
she asked him. "Oh, yes, you're right." He took a white envelope from his jacket and handed it to Winnie. Then he closed the door again and went to meet the stranger. After he had left the shop, Mrs. Verloc stood in the dining room looking about her home. Everything that had once seemed so comfortable and safe now looked like it could be taken away at any moment. She decided to keep the money under her clothing, and as soon as she had finished hiding it, the sound of another customer entering the shop could be heard. She walked in and found a man standing in front of the counter, looking around the store. He then turned toward her and smiled as if they might have met before. She felt that he was a little familiar, but he did not seem like a customer. "Hi, is your husband home?" asked Inspector Heat.
"I'm afraid not. He's just left,"
she answered. "Oh, well, I just needed to ask him a few important questions. Do you think he'll be back soon?" Receiving no answer from Winnie, he continued,
It's quite important. Could you tell me where he might have gone?" Mrs. Verloc simply turned around and began to put things onto the shelf behind her. Inspector Heat, surprised at her ability to remain calm, watched her for a few moments before asking her if she knew who he was. "Surely, you must know that I'm a policeman."
"So?"
"My name's Inspector Heat. I'm the Chief Inspector of the Department of Special Crimes." Again, his introduction was met with silence and an empty, uninterested stare from Mrs. Verloc. The inspector decided to question her a little bit. "You say that he went out a few minutes ago. Did he go alone?"
"No, he went with a stranger who came to visit."
"And what can you tell me about this stranger?" When she described the man, he knew right away that it had been the assistant commissioner. His heart suddenly filled with anger. "Ha! I knew it!" he shouted. Even though he was terribly upset by his boss's behavior, he decided not to wait for the men to return. "Well, I guess that I'll go then. Thank you." Seeing that Mrs. Verloc cared very little about whether he stayed or not, the chief inspector decided that questioning her a little more might be useful. Even though he knew that the assistant commissioner was planning to take away the case from him, he wanted to find out the truth on his own. "I wonder if you might be able to tell me what your husband has been involved in lately," he said to the stone-faced woman behind the counter.
"I don't know what you mean,"
she responded. "You know I have come here for a very specific purpose." Mrs. Verloc was not aware of anything that had happened that day. She had only very briefly looked at the day's newspaper, and the young boys who always shouted out the latest news in the street did not usually come to their neighborhood.
"I haven't heard any news,"
she said, looking him straight in the face. "Well, I'm sorry, but I can't believe that. Everyone's talking about it. Your husband must have mentioned something to you."
"No,"
she said, shaking her head slowly from side to side. "Well, we found a piece of cloth from a coat that we think might have been stolen. That is what I wanted to talk with your husband about."
"I don't think we're missing any coats here,"
Mrs. Verloc said confidently. The inspector looked around the shop. It looks like you have a lot of pens for sale here, and the ink looks to be purple as well. You know, it's very interesting that the coat we found has your address written on it in purple ink."
"Really? Well then, the coat can't belong to anyone else but my brother."
"And could you tell me where your brother is? I'd like to speak with him."
"He's in the countryside, staying at a friend's house for a week."
That's interesting, too. We got the coat from near the countryside. Could you tell me who he's staying with?"
"Michaelis,"
she said in a quiet voice, which seemed to show that she suddenly realized something. "Really? Very good," the inspector responded with a smile. "In fact, just perfect. Now, your brother, is he a tall, dark-haired fellow?"
"No, he's just the opposite, short and yellow-haired."
"I see. And could you tell me why your brother would write his address on the inside of his coat?"
"Well, actually, I wrote the address myself. He has a disability that keeps him from being able to think quickly or clearly. It's very easy for him to get lost. If he were to lose his way, he could easily look inside his shirt and ask someone for help.
The chief inspector listened quietly and then asked if the boy was easy to make upset or uncomfortable.
Oh, yes. Any little thing could upset him, especially when he sees someone being treated badly,
She answered, and then, stopping for a moment, asked what exactly had happened to her brother. The inspector pulled the evening newspaper out of his pocket. He loved horse racing and often liked to read the race results after work. It helped him to relax and forget about his job. He continued to look for something deeper down in his pockets until he finally presented her with the torn piece of cloth that he had found from her brother's pile of body parts. "Does this look familiar?" he asked. Mrs. Verloc looked at the cloth closely with a confused and concerned look. She answered in a weak voice that it was from her brother's coat.
"Why is it so badly damaged?"
she asked, her voice now shaking. At that moment the inspector knew everything. It was obvious that Mr. Verloc was the big man that had been described by the old woman in Greenwich Park. Taking the cloth from her fingers, he again spoke. "It appears, Mrs. Verloc, that you may know more about what happened this morning than you realize." She did not say another word. None of this made any sense to her. She could not move, so surprised and confused she was. Even when the door of the store opened and her husband entered, she did not look to see who it was. The chief inspector was happy to see that he had come back without the assistant commissioner. "What do you want?" asked Mr. Verloc. "Just a few moments of your time, that's all. I have some questions to ask you." "Fine, follow me. We'll talk in the house," he said, heading for the door to his home. As soon as the two men went inside, Mrs. Verloc ran to the door and listened carefully to what they discussed. Their voices could be heard as if they were in the same room with her. "I know you're the one," said the inspector, pointing his finger at the large man's chest. "Well, why don't you arrest me then?" asked Verloc. "Go ahead." "No, I'm afraid that this case is not mine any longer. The man you were just with will have to discover the truth on his own. But you just remember that I was the man who first discovered the truth. You remember that." Mrs. Verloc could not hear the next few exchanges very clearly, but she assumed that the inspector had shown her husband the torn piece of cloth, for she heard Mr. Verloc say, "I didn't know she was writing in his clothing." Then came the voice of the inspector. "What were you thinking? You were crazy to do such a thing," whispered the inspector angrily. "Yes, for the past 30 days I have been crazy, but I'm perfectly clear in my mind now. Everything is finished, and I will clear my brain of all the terrible information it has held for so long, and accept what happens to me." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm going to tell everyone everything that I know," answered Verloc. "We've known each other for a while now. I think you know the kind of man I am. You know that I'm not a criminal. You should leave the country immediately," answered the inspector. "You would like that, wouldn't you?" "No, I'm going to stay and tell them everything I know." "Fine,"
responded the inspector without appearing worried. "I'm more interested in learning about how you got away from the park." "I started walking back to the train when suddenly I heard the explosion. It wasn't supposed to have happened so soon. I was lucky, because there were no people around at all." After hearing this, Mrs. Verloc felt her whole body become cold. Again, the men began to speak more quietly, making it more difficult for her to understand. However, a few sentences came through quite clearly to her ears. "It seems that he must have accidentally fallen down," the inspector said. Then, after an unclear question from her husband, "Completely destroyed. He was nothing but a pile of meat when I saw him." Winnie jumped to her feet and, almost falling, ran to the counter where the inspector's newspaper was still lying. "You plan to admit your participation in the bombing, then?" asked the inspector. Mr. Verloc said that he would admit his guilt. The inspector did not know how he felt about this. It would cause problems for a lot of bad people, but it would also mean losing all of the secret connections that he used to do his job. "I'm an honest man. I must tell the people what I know," Mr. Verloc said. "I don't know what that man you were just with has promised you for your information, but I would not believe a word that he says. They'll probably kill you in the end. Again, my suggestion is that you run away. Don't waste time." The big man listened to him silently. He had a sad and hopeless look on his face. "There's nowhere for me to go," he finally answered, then adding, "It's too bad that you can't just arrest me now. I wouldn't fight you." He was looking at the door when he said this, thinking about the woman on the other side. "I used the boy because he was stupid and innocent. The police would have done nothing more than send him to a hospital instead of jail. He would have been cared for there. I thought it was the best way to do it. I didn't plan for this to happen." "That's nonsense. How could you do such a thing?" "A disgusting man from the embassy gave me no choice," answered Verloc. Winnie did not notice the inspector as he passed through the store and exited through the front door. She sat in a chair with her head in her hands. Her fingers were so deeply pushed into the skin of her forehead, it looked like she might begin to pull her whole face off at any moment. Her pain and anger was so obvious that the inspector looked away from her as soon as he saw her. He feared that she might explode at any moment, either in screams or tears. Chapter 10. When he returned to the great man's home, the assistant commissioner was greeted by Toodles. The secretary had not expected him to return so soon, for the great man had arranged for a meeting at midnight. He assumed that things had not gone well at all, and prepared to speak very politely to the man in order to make him feel better. "You can go into his office right away. He's busy worrying about all of the people of England." It was obvious that the boy thought the great man was something like a god. "Follow me." As they walked down the hallway, Toodles could not help wondering what had happened. He did not want to upset the assistant commissioner, but he could not control his curiosity any longer. "Good news, I hope?" he said, turning to the assistant commissioner. "Oh, excellent. He'll be so pleased," Toodles said with a large smile. "I guess you've caught yourself a little fish. You could say that, yes. But I'm going to throw him back in the water so that he can lead me to the bigger ones." "What sort of bigger ones?" asked Toodles. "Oh, a very popular one. You may even have seen him before." "Me? Really? Where would I have seen this fish?" "Why, you've probably seen him at the Explorers." The Explorers was the name of a club for very rich and powerful men. The great man himself was a member of the club, and Toodles sometimes went there with him. "Do you mean that this fish might be a member of the Explorers?" asked Toodles in great surprise. "One of the highest members, actually," answered the Assistant Commissioner proudly. "My goodness, I can't believe it." "Please, don't tell anyone about this." "How horrible that you would think that I could do such a thing." For the rest of the way to the great man's office the two men did not speak. When the Assistant Commissioner entered the large office, he found it very dark inside. Sir Ethelred was sitting at his desk, which had nothing on it except for a little statue and a small green lamp. The great man told him to have a seat and asked him what news he had so quickly gathered. "Sir Ethelred, it seems that the man that Inspector Heat wished to protect, Mr. Verloc, wants to tell the police everything he knows. I did nothing more than walk into his store and tell him that I knew he was involved in the bombing. He then told me everything. He told me whose idea the bombing was, and he told me who did the bombing. It seems that it was his brother-in-law who carried the bomb into the park. A strange story, actually. Not a normal young boy. I won't give you the details now, however." "So, what else did he tell you?" asked the great man. "He told me that the boy was living with Michaelis for a short time, but that Michaelis was not involved in the bombing." "Are you sure?" the man asked. "Absolutely, sir. For several days Verloc had visited Michaelis's home and told him that he and the boy were going out for a walk. The morning of the bombing he did the very same thing. Michaelis had no reason to think that anything bad was going to happen. The anger in Verloc was easy to see. He told me that something had happened that made him quite upset for a month." The Assistant Commissioner then told the man about Verloc's encounter with Mr. Vladimir. He did not seem to doubt the story at all, however. The great man found it a little unbelievable. He felt that the embassy would destroy his life if he failed to bomb Greenwich. He was truly frightened by them, the Assistant Commissioner said. "And did you spend much time with Verloc?" asked the man. "I guess it must have been around 40 minutes. He was quite uncomfortable, and I could see that he was upset about having lost his brother-in-law. Obviously, the bomb was not supposed to have exploded in the poor boy's arms. Something went wrong. It's clear to me that Verloc is not a criminal at heart. I think he feels quite guilty now." The great man placed his large cheek on his fat white hand and asked where Verloc was now. When the Assistant Commissioner answered that he had not arrested him, but allowed him to return to his store, Sir Ethelred expressed his concern that the man might try to run away. "I don't believe he'll run, sir. You should have seen this man. Believe me, he has no strength to do anything now. He feels far too sad and guilty. I also wanted to inform you of all that I'd learned before taking any action."
"All right."
"I will call for you tomorrow morning after I speak with the highest lawyer we have.
"Do you have any other news?"
"No, sir. Nothing else you need to know at this time."
"Fine.
"Did I hear you say that Verloc is married?" "He has a wife, sir."
It seems that Verloc would have disappeared and left the country. However, his wife would not agree to it." The big man did not say anything else, but seemed to turn his thinking toward some other important matter he had to deal with. The assistant commissioner decided to stop there and then quietly left the office. After that, he returned to his home and changed into proper evening clothing, for he planned to join his wife at the wealthy woman's home. From the time he left Sir Ethelred's office to the time he arrived at the woman's home, he thought deeply about all that he had learned that evening. He was disgusted with Mr. Verloc, but very happy with himself. At the woman's party, the assistant commissioner found her talking with a man and a woman.
"Ah, your wife told us not to expect you tonight,"
the hostess cried when she saw him.
"I had planned not to come, but I finished early," he explained. "And I'm pleased to say that I've learned that Michaelis is innocent."
"I'm disappointed that the police thought he was involved at all,"
she answered with an unhappy look.
"We can't ignore his past, you know. Anyway, he's clear now."
The lady then turned to the man she had been speaking with earlier and introduced him to the assistant commissioner as Mr. Vladimir. They shook hands and said hello in a polite but rather cold way.
"You should hear the way Mr. Vladimir has been talking. I think he's trying to make me frightened. All this talk about the need to control society more and more,"
said the woman sitting next to him.
"especially since this bombing in Greenwich. I didn't know that it was so serious."
"Really? Maybe he's not trying to frighten you at all," commented the assistant commissioner. "Maybe this is just the kind of thing he always says. I'm sure that he is well aware of the seriousness of the bombing."
Mr. Vladimir, although involved in another conversation with the hostess of the party, heard every word the assistant commissioner had said. It was not exactly clear to him what the man was trying to say. He feared the police in England, much like some people fear dogs or insects. He could not help it. However, he felt the need to say something to the assistant commissioner.
"I am very familiar with these bombers, yes. They cause a lot of problems for us. However, it seems that the English police don't mind them at all. They let them run around the city like little children on holiday."
Mr. Vladimir then got up and left. The assistant commissioner arose from his chair and prepared to leave as well. The hostess, however, asked him why he was going.
"It seems that my work is not yet finished after all," he answered.
"I see. Something about Mr.
"Possibly. Yes, it could be something quite big."
He then went to the front hallway to get his coat and hat. He found Mr. Vladimir there, preparing to leave. The assistant commissioner, having fewer items to collect, was able to exit the house first. Walking to the bottom of the outside front steps, he pretended to be trying to decide in which direction to walk. Mr. Vladimir soon followed. Seeing the policeman on the sidewalk, he wondered if he might be waiting to talk with him. Trying not to look worried, Mr. Vladimir lit a cigar and began to look both directions down the street for a taxi. The only ones he could see were too far away to call. He would have to walk. When he got to the bottom of the staircase and turned left, the policeman began to walk beside him. At first, the two men said nothing to one another. Mr. Vladimir became terribly angry inside. He wanted to scream at the man next to him, but instead he complained about the weather.
"Terribly cold, isn't it?"
he said loudly.
"Not too bad, actually,"
answered the assistant commissioner. "We caught a fellow by the name of Verloc today," he added with a calm voice. Mr. Vladimir tried his best to control himself, but could not prevent the question, "What?" from coming out of his mouth. "I'm certain you are familiar with him," said the assistant commissioner. "He told us that you know him quite well."
"Obviously, this dog is not telling the truth."
Mr. Vladimir spoke in a low, angry voice. He was seriously impressed with the ability of the English police to have so quickly discovered the bomber. He began to feel ill and dropped his cigar on the ground, crushing it under his shoe. "It's good that we found Mr. Verloc. This bombing has given us a good excuse to start being tougher with spies and secret agents in England. They are a real problem for us, and quite a danger to society as well. Of course, because there are so many of them here, we've decided to go after the people who give them work. We're looking for the bosses. After we take Mr. Verloc to court, all of England will become aware of the problems these foreigners are causing them."
"And why do you think that people will believe what Mr. Verloc tells them?"
asked Mr. Vladimir angrily. "He has so much information to share. I don't think the people will have any choice but to believe it."
"So, you will take him to court? That is your plan?"
asked Mr. Vladimir. "What else can we do? He's guilty. We have to do our job."
"I don't see why you must make it into a big public trial."
Mr. Vladimir's face showed that he was worried. At that moment, the assistant commissioner realized that Mr. Verloc's information actually had some truth in it. "Anyway, it's also good for our police department. It shows the people that we are quite good at what we do and that we can be trusted. I mean, look at what we've managed to discover in just less than half a day. We know who the bomber was. We know who made the bombs. We know who planned it. And finally, we also have a good idea who hired these men to do the job. However, if we wanted to go to the very heart of the case, I'm afraid we'd have to visit another country."
"What? You mean foreigners are to blame for this whole thing?"
asked Vladimir. "Well, yes. Embassies are considered a part of the country they represent, aren't they?" The assistant commissioner, when he said this, looked directly into the eyes of the man standing in front of him. "I chose to tell you about this because your government always complains that the English police are not strong enough or clever enough to deal with its criminals. I think that you can see now that this is not at all true." "Yes, without a doubt," Mr. Vladimir responded, hardly opening his mouth. "And now, because we have a secret agent who's willing to talk, we're going to get the man who gave him his job." Mr. Vladimir, seeing a taxi approaching, raised his hand. He did not say anything further to the assistant commissioner, but climbed into the carriage. "Oh, I'm surprised you're not paying this place a visit here,"
said the assistant commissioner, pointing to a large brick building next to the wealthy woman's home. "I see a lot of your friends inside." The carriage then drove away down the street, passing the building the assistant commissioner had pointed to. It was the Explorers Club. Chapter 11. Mr. Verloc could see his wife sitting in a chair in the store. He felt very sorry for her, but he was also glad that the inspector had told her the news. The idea of telling her himself had frightened him terribly. Now he just had to deal with her sadness. Dealing with her sadness had been a part of his plan, actually. However, his plan was for Stevie to be arrested and eventually put into a hospital. That would have terribly upset his wife, of course. But he could have handled it. This, however, was much more serious. And now he wished that he had not used the boy at all in the bombing. He thought that everything had been arranged well. During his walks with Stevie, he discovered that the boy liked and trusted him as much as Winnie. Mr. Verloc, during those same walks, talked with the boy about the police and helped him to understand that they were not good people. He had shown the boy several times exactly what to do with the bomb. All that he had to do was deliver it and then walk away. The professor had said that the boy would have a full quarter of an hour to place the bomb in the Greenwich Observatory. What Mr. Verloc had not thought about was the possibility that the boy might accidentally fall. And, of course, he had no idea that his wife had written their address inside the boy's clothing. That was completely unexpected. Why hadn't she told him about that? He remembered her promising that Stevie would never get lost, that he would always be able to get back home from now on. And she was right. Stevie had returned home, but on the tongues of the police. Mr. Verloc entered his store and walked over to where Winnie was sitting. He felt a strong need to speak with her. He thought about everything that had happened that day and accepted it. There was nothing that could change it. "I'm sorry, Winnie," he said softly. "Nothing was supposed to happen to Stevie today. It was all a terrible accident." Mrs. Verloc's body shook when her husband began to speak. She continued to hold her head in her hands. The secret agent stared at her for a few moments, giving her plenty of time to think about his apology. He noticed the newspaper torn and lying at his wife's feet. "I can't believe the way that inspector walked right in here and just gave you the news without any pity," he continued. "I'd spent the whole day trying to think of the best way to tell you myself. I hope that you believe me when I say that I am very sorry and that this was not supposed to happen to your brother." After the explosion, something had awakened inside of him. His love for his wife had awakened. Seeing her shaking and without anything to say to him, he decided to stop there and give her time to think on her own. He went back into the house and saw that she had left some food out on the table. Grabbing a large piece of bread, he sat down at the table and started to have dinner. He had not had anything to eat all day. That morning, when he had gone to Michaelis's home in the countryside to get Stevie, he had been too nervous to eat. He arrived there and found that Michaelis was upstairs working on his book. He shouted that he was taking Stevie home for a few days, and then immediately left with the boy. Now, everything was over. The police would handle everything from here on. There was nothing that he could do except eat. And he did. He ate everything that had been left out for him on that table.
and he ate it all quickly. Occasionally he would look up and see his wife still sitting in the same position she had been in when he left her side. When he finished the meal, he walked back over to her. "All right, it's all over now. They're coming for me tomorrow, and you'll have to have a clear mind." Her body shook even more now. She was crying heavily. This made Mr. Verloc feel uncomfortable. He felt sorry for his wife, but at the same time he could not understand the kind of love she felt for her brother. It was time to think about their future now. But this could not be done with her crying so much. He became a little impatient with her. "All right, enough. Why don't you look at me?" he asked a little angrily. Then, without removing her hands from her face, she said,
"I will never look at you again."
The words surprised him. He could not believe how upset she was. It seemed so unnecessary. Her brother was gone. Yes, that was sad, but there was nothing either of them could do about it now. "Well, I can't have you crying in my store all day and night," he yelled. However, seeing that this did not help the situation, he began to talk in a quieter voice again. "Crying isn't going to change anything. Things could be worse, you know. Just imagine, what if I had been the one who had died?" Winnie then became very quiet. Mr. Verloc suddenly felt uncomfortable. He wanted her to look at him, damn it. He took hold of her arms and tried to pull her hands away from her face, but she resisted. Finally, after several moments of pulling at her, she suddenly broke away from him and ran into the house. Mr. Verloc sat on the chair she had been using and thought about his situation for a moment. There was no doubt about it. He would be going to jail. However, he believed that he would be released after a short time, and then he would go to another country to live. The failure of the bombing upset him. But his problems now were all because his wife had written their address inside her brother's clothing. He'd be a hero now if she had not done that. Mr. Vladimir would have admired him. He did not blame his wife. She had only written the address to help her brother. She was innocent. He thought about how his wife would live while he was in jail. She would be lonely, and her loneliness would only make her miss her brother even more. She might not be able to take care of the store in that kind of condition. What would happen then? He needed the store to stay open. They needed the money. But it was clear that this could not be discussed tonight. Mr. Verloc got up from his chair, locked the front door, turned off the light, and headed back toward his home. He found Mrs. Verloc seated at the kitchen table. It was the same seat that Stevie used to draw his circles. Her head was down, lying on top of her arms. She had never shown interest in Mr. Verloc's activities outside of the shop. She had never asked about what he did. That made it harder for him to try and explain things to her now. How could she possibly understand why he did the things he did? How could she understand how mad a man can become because of the threats of someone like Mr. Vladimir? "If you knew the man who was pushing me around, treating me like a dog, and threatening to take away everything that you and I have, you would understand why I had to do what I did. I didn't tell you about my problems because I didn't want to upset you and make you fear the future." He walked back and forth in the dining room next to the kitchen. He spoke every time he passed the kitchen door.
I've saved so many important people's lives over the years. And then this man comes along and pushes me around like I'm a fool. What a dog! I risked my life to get all kinds of information to save those people. I could have been killed at any moment if any of those terrorists had seen me go to the embassy. He walked into the kitchen and filled a glass full of water. He could see out of the corner of his eye that Winnie was now sitting back in her chair, looking at him. He took several long drinks from his glass before speaking again. I would have beaten that man silly if the thought of you had not come into my mind when I was in his office. I so wanted to kill him, but I knew that you needed me, so I stopped myself. Oh, how I would have loved to strike him with all of my strength, right in the middle of that intelligent little face of his. And he couldn't have called anyone for help. No way. You know why, don't you? She looked at him with empty eyes. Her face seemed to be made of rock.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Mr. Verloc stopped trying to explain. He was very tired and upset. He wanted only to sleep now, and it would come very easily tonight, he thought, because everything was over now. Everything was in the hands of other people. He only had to wait. Why don't you go upstairs, get in bed, and cry all night? He suggested gently. Get it all out of you. If Stevie had died of a terrible illness, after weeks or months of treatment and care, Mrs. Verloc could have followed the advice of Mr. Verloc. She could have cried her sadness out of herself eventually. However, the news of her brother's death now made her heart turn extremely cold. When she thought about her life, she could only think of it in terms of her brother. From childhood to present, her imagination filled her with dreamlike images of her caring for her brother in beautiful castles or cute little houses in the countryside. Then memories of her father's cruel treatment, the beatings, the yelling, and the threats entered her mind. Those days of working at her mother's hotel, dealing with horrible men, working hard all day and all night, watching little Stevie clean the guests' shoes, came back to her. She remembered a man who used to come into the hotel, the butcher. He always wore his nicest clothes and a hat made of dried grass. He was always cheerful. Life with him seemed like it would be full of happiness and good times. But he wanted only her, not her family. Then came Mr. Verloc, a lazy but friendly man who always seemed to have money to spend. Life with him did not seem like it would be nearly as fun as with the butcher. However, he could accept her family, and that was what decided things in her mind. Finally, she recalled watching her brother walking down the road with her husband side by side. She remembered thinking how it looked like a boy with his father. And then she put this thought into words and spoke it aloud.
Like a boy with his father.
Her words interrupted Mr. Verloc's continued threats of destroying the people at the embassy. I'll kill them all. Let them try to ruin a man's life like this. They'll see how things can get turned around. I'll destroy them. I'll tell the world everything. What? Did you just say something? He looked at his wife and found that she was sitting very still. Her eyes did not move from the wall directly in front of her. He wanted her to say something, but she would not. In fact, she could not. Inside, she was screaming and pulling out her hair, but her mouth would not open to let all of that anger and sadness out. Her thoughts kept repeating over and over.
He killed my brother. He took him away from me.
And in a way, She partly blamed herself for her brother's death, for letting this horrible man take him away. Meanwhile, Mr. Verloc had begun to talk again about planning for the future. "I'll probably be gone for about 2 years, I guess. During that time, you'll need to take care of the store. You must be careful, because the revolutionists will be watching you all of the time. I'll let you know as soon as I can when I'll be free. Then we'll sell the store and leave the country." He explained that the revolutionists were going to want to kill him because he was going to tell all that he knew. Enemies would be all around, waiting for a chance to put their knives deep into his stomach. However, once in jail, he would be safe. Then, after a couple of years, people would have forgotten him, and the two of them could easily go to another country to start a new life. Mrs. Verloc heard the man who killed her brother speaking. He was talking about going away, leaving the country. Her first thought was,
"But what about my brother? He can't go abroad."
For a moment, she had forgotten that Stevie was dead. But now it came back to her. He was gone, taken away by the man whom she had lived with and trusted for the last 7 years. Another thought then arose.
If Stevie is gone, then I have no more reason to be with this man. I've no more reason to be here. In fact, I've no reason to live.
She then stood up. A new feeling came over her. She belonged to nothing and no one any longer. Seeing his wife walking out of the room and up the stairs, Mr. Verloc said, "Good. You go have a rest. I'll join you soon." Mrs. Verloc turned around for a brief moment and silently moved her head up and then down. Then she continued to climb the staircase. After she had gone, Mr. Verloc began to eat again. He truly did feel sad for his wife. He even felt sorry for Stevie. "It's too bad the boy had to go and get himself killed like that," he thought. As he chewed his food, he became aware of the total silence in the house. It was strange that no sound came from their bedroom upstairs. Suddenly, Mr. Verloc lost his desire to eat. He sat still, trying to listen for his wife's movements. After a few moments, sounds did come, and he felt relieved. Winnie had walked over to the bedroom window and opened it. No doubt she needed some fresh air. A few minutes passed, and then he heard the window being closed again. Following this, he heard her open the closet and place a pair of shoes on the floor. She put them on. Mr. Verloc's eyes were pointed up toward the ceiling the whole time he listened. Occasionally, he moved about in his chair or shuffled his feet, but always very quietly so that every sound could be heard. A little later, Winnie appeared at the top of the staircase and walked down. She was going out. She belonged to no one now. She had opened the window earlier either to tell everyone that her husband was a killer or to jump through it and kill herself. But now, here she was, all dressed and ready to go out. Mr. Verloc assumed that she wanted to go to her mother's new home. "Now, Winnie, you can't go out there. It's because of you that I've got the police coming after me." He then tried to speak more gently. "I'm not angry with you, but I won't agree to you going out there tonight. You must stay here." This made perfect sense to Winnie. Of course, the murderer did not want her leaving his house. He would make her his prisoner forever. She had not planned to go to her mother. In truth, she had no idea where she was going. She just wanted to get away from this house and this man. She thought about running, but knew that he would easily catch her if not on her way to the door, then out on the street. Mr. Verloc began to lose his patience. He started to yell at his wife.
"Why don't you speak? Now is not the time to play your stupid little games. My God, woman, show me that you have some strength. You know it's partly your fault. You had your brother spend time with me while I was trying to think of a way to protect our family. In fact, yes, I'll say it. Stevie wouldn't be dead now if you hadn't gotten in the way of my thinking. Ah, I wish I'd never gone to that damned Greenwich Park."
Park?
Mrs. Verloc thought. Yes, it all happened in a park. She imagined the explosion and little Stevie's body flying in all different directions. She remembered what the inspector had said about their having to use a shovel to pick up all of the pieces. Then her mind became very clear. She was now not only totally free, but also in complete control of herself. She stood up and walked over to the fireplace. Mr. Verloc, feeling very tired, had gone and thrown himself down on the couch. There was a moment of silence between them. "Winnie," he called to her without looking at her any longer. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling. She responded. "Why don't you come over here and sit next to me for a while?" he said. She immediately began to walk toward the couch. As she walked beside the dinner table, her hand took hold of the cutting knife that had been resting on a plate. As she got closer to the couch, her appearance seemed more and more similar to her brother's. Even her lower lip hung down like Stevie's. Mr. Verloc heard his wife approaching, and he could see her shadow on the wall. It was obvious that she held a knife raised in one of her hands. It was clear that she was coming to kill him. He thought about a way to avoid her attempt at murder. Yes, he would jump up now and grab the nearest chair and hit her over the head with it. But before he could do anything, the knife had already fallen deep into his chest. Mrs. Verloc stood still now. Her head was completely empty of thought. She no longer looked like her brother. She was herself again, but now without any responsibilities. Her freedom was so complete that she did not know what to do with herself. Then the sound of the clock came to her ears. Tick-tock, tick-tock. But as she listened more carefully, she noticed that the sound was more like tick, 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 tick. She looked down at her husband's still body. He looked like he was resting. She then saw the handle of the knife that was still stuck deep in his chest. Blood was starting to flow along it and drip to the floor. Tick, tick, tick. She suddenly awakened from this momentary dream and let out a little scream. Her husband was dead. Chapter 12. Winnie was frightened now. She could not let her eyes fall upon the body of her husband. However, her fear was not of the dead Mr. Verloc, the murderer of her younger brother. He was nothing now, nothing at all. No, she was afraid of being hung by the police, for she was now a killer herself. She imagined what the newspaper reports would say about her hanging. She was hung in the yard of the central jail. Her neck broke immediately after falling 14 feet from the platform. Those present at the hanging were, and so on. Her image of the moment was so clear that she tightened her whole body in preparation for the pull of the rope that would suddenly break her neck. Winnie decided to throw herself into the river. She headed for the front door of the shop. When she entered the outside air, she felt as though she were already sinking underneath the dirty water of the Thames. Not a single face looked friendly or even familiar. She realized in that moment that no one would care about her death. There was her mother, of course, but she did not want to think about her now. It was too painful. She moved very unsteadily along the street. To prevent herself from falling, she took hold of the wall or of street-lights as she passed them. She began to fear that the police would arrest her before she could reach the river. Images of her own hanging kept coming back into her brain. Falling 14 feet from the platform. She now had a strong desire to live. The idea of going to another country now seemed wonderful to her. Then she suddenly found that a man was standing before her with both of his hands on her shoulders.
"Are you all right, Mrs. Verloc?" asked Comrade Ossipon.
He had seen her walking as if she were drunk and ran over to help her before she fell to the ground.
Ossipon,
she whispered.
were you on your way to our home?
"Yes, I was actually. You've been in my thoughts a lot lately. After I saw the newspapers, I decided to visit you and see how you're doing. I don't know if you realize it, but I care very much about you."
She surprised him by putting her arms around his waist. He felt himself being pushed to walk forward. He allowed her to do so. As they walked, Mrs. Verloc spoke again.
In fact, I was just leaving the house to come and find you. I need your help,
she said. Ossipon felt wonderful inside. This was going much more easily than he had expected.
"Well, I'm glad that you thought of me. I don't know anyone else who would like to help you more than me."
Are you aware of my problem?
she asked.
"Well, I saw the paper and then spoke with the professor. I knew after that what had happened. I came over right away. It's because, well, I love you."
He had no idea that Mrs. Verloc saw him as her only hope to continue living. He was all that she had at the moment.
I knew you did,
answered Mrs. Verloc.
"It was that obvious?"
he said, trying to hide his true desire, to get whatever money and valuables Comrade Verloc had left behind. He did feel a little guilty about stealing from a newly dead friend, but if he did not get the money, then someone else would just come along sooner or later and take it.
"I could not tell if you knew," he went on.
"You never seemed at all interested in me."
I was a married woman. Of course I couldn't show interest.
"I must admit, I never thought that Verloc deserved you."
That man caused me to throw away the last 7 years of my life,
she cried.
And yet, I always felt that you truly loved him and that he, too, loved you,"
Ossipon said, attempting to make up for the bad things he had just said about his friend.
I married him. I fed him. I washed his clothing. I watched over his shop. But I never loved him.
Her face was hot and her eyes full of hate.
That man was evil. That's what he was. I only loved one man. He was a butcher, and he loved me too. However, his father would not allow him to marry a woman with a mother who couldn't walk and a brother who had a disability. 7 years. Gone.
Ossipon was surprised to hear all of this. He had no idea that his friend had been such an awful person. He could not imagine what horrible things must have happened in that home that, to him, had always seemed so comfortable and quiet. All that he could think to say to her was, "Poor girl, you poor, poor girl. Well, it's all over now. He's dead and gone." She jumped at this.
You know he's dead? How? I had to do it. I had to.
Comrade Ossipon found her words strange, even crazy. What in the devil was she talking about? He began to wonder if Comrade Verloc had not purposefully killed himself in Greenwich Park that morning, just to get away from his mad wife. It suddenly seemed possible that Mrs. Verloc might truly have been the evil person, not his friend. He also wondered how it was that she knew her husband was dead. Not even the police had any idea who the bomber was. It did not seem likely that Verloc would have told his wife about his plans. He asked her how she found out the news.
Inspector Heat came to my home and told me,
she answered.
He had a badly damaged piece of cloth from his coat. He asked me if I was familiar with it.
My God, the police came to your home? He asked with obvious fear in his voice.
Another man came too. I think he might have been from the embassy or something.
What? The embassy?
Yes, I'm sure you know. The one on Chesham Street. He was always complaining about those men. But please, let's not talk about them any longer. It's too upsetting.
Fine, of course, he said very gently. Embassy? He thought to himself. What could he have been doing with an embassy?
It was a lot to think about, this embassy business. He was extremely surprised and troubled. However, Comrade Ossipon decided to ignore all of the alarms going off inside of him for the moment. Mrs. Verloc seemed willing to give herself to him, and that was what he needed to pay the most attention to. There was money to be made, after all.
I'd like to leave the country today, if possible,
she said.
Oh, but it won't be. The soonest we could go would be tomorrow morning. The trains have already gone for the day, he answered.
He did not mind the idea of going abroad with her. He had wanted to get away from England for quite a while. But there was the store to think about. No, he did not want to keep that. It was surrounded by police, and apparently embassy people too. No, he would get rid of the store. The last thing to consider was whether she knew where her husband had kept his money.
I need a place to stay tonight,
she said.
My place is no good because I have a roommate.
But I can't go back home. You must help me,
she cried.
I could try to find a place, but I haven't any money. And there's the train ride tomorrow as well.
How can we go without money? He asked, hoping she would suggest something. She thought for a moment. Ossipon's hopes seemed to lower a great deal. It did not look as though she knew anything about the money. But then she suddenly stood up straight and cried,
I almost forgot. He took all of the money out of the bank. It's ours to use now. All of it.
What?
asked Ossipon, trying not to look excited by the news.
You mean everything was taken out?
Yes.
Well, then I suppose we'll be all right after all, he said,
keeping his eagerness hidden inside himself. She put her arms around him and began to cry. He put his around her as well, but without really touching her. She then said something that both confused him and made him feel uncomfortable.
Tell me that you'll take my life before they find me. You must do this. I was going to do it myself, but I cannot. I'm too afraid.
What are you talking about? He said.
The only thing that kept him from running away from her was the thought of her money.
Don't you know what I did? Can't you see what will happen if I don't get away tonight?
He did not understand. She seemed to be mad. However, he needed to save her in order to get his hands on that money. Then he remembered that there was an evening boat that they could catch. He told Mrs. Verloc about it, and she became hopeful again.
Oh, but I must return to the store for a moment. I think I left the door unlocked.
Ossipon did not understand why that was so important, but thinking that she might have left the money there, he did not argue. When they arrived at the store, Mrs. Verloc pointed in through the doorway and asked Ossipon if he would go inside and turn off the light in the house. She was too afraid to do it herself. What a crazy woman, he thought as he entered the shop and walked toward the door to the house. However, when he looked for the light inside the house, he saw the body of Mr. Verloc lying on the couch. Ossipon wanted to cry out, but he controlled himself. He became more confused than ever and began to wonder if this had all been arranged by the police as a way to catch him. He turned around and headed back into the shop. His head spun wildly, and he felt the need to throw up everything he had eaten that day, especially that beer he had had with the professor. Then he heard Mrs. Verloc's voice behind him.
The police are here. I'm afraid that one of them might have seen me.
She then ran toward Ossipon and kneeled down low to the ground with him. A light from outside suddenly passed through the shop windows for a moment and then disappeared. Mrs. Verloc took hold of Ossipon's coat and whispered,
I don't want to hang. I don't want to hang. If he enters the shop, you must take my life. Promise me you'll do it.
Ossipon thought about how foolish he was to have gotten himself into this mess. Only 20 minutes ago he was walking around the neighborhood safe and unthreatened. Now he could easily be arrested and put into jail. Mrs. Verloc could tell the police anything. It would be much easier for them to believe that he had killed Mr. Verloc rather than she. He could hardly believe that she was capable of such a thing himself.
I had to do it, you see,
she continued.
He took my brother away from me, killed him, and then he came back home to me and expected me to forgive him. He even expected me to accept some of the blame for my brother's death. Then he asked me to sit next to him. That's when I stuck him with the knife, the bloody pig.
Mrs. Verloc then let out a horrible cry, causing Ossipon to run over to her and cover her mouth with his hand. He knocked her to the floor, and she wrapped her arms around his legs. He then understood what had happened. Her brother had been the bomber.
I won't let you leave me until you've properly killed me,
she said. Comrade Ossipon felt trapped by this woman. He even considered choking her with his bare hands just to shut her up. If he ran, he knew that she too would run after him, making all kinds of noise that would attract the police. Let's go, he said. We have to leave now if we're going to catch our train.
To where?
She asked, her voice now quiet again. We'll go to France first. Now come, you go into the street first. Outside they managed to find a taxi. On their way to the station, Ossipon explained that they should not be seen together. The police knew him well, and if she were seen with him, they would almost immediately guess who she was. No, it would be best if she went to the platform alone. He would then buy their tickets. walk past her on the platform, and secretly hand her the ticket. They would get on the train separately.
"Now, if you'll just give me the money," he said.
Without saying anything, Mrs. Verloc pulled the envelope her husband had given her earlier in the evening from her dress and handed it to Comrade Ossipon. He put it under his coat right away and asked her how much was inside.
"I never counted it,"
she answered, adding,
"falling 14 feet through the door."
They rode in silence for a while. Comrade Ossipon's behavior had quickly changed. Instead of speaking softly and using caring, gentle words, he now looked like a businessman and spoke only in a serious voice.
"Tell me, do you know if Mr. Verloc used his real name at the bank? I'm asking because if he did use his real name, we may run into trouble later on. The police will know the numbers on the money we're using. They'll easily find us. We'd have to have the money changed, and that could be quite expensive. If he used another name, there'd be no problem, and we could spend the money however we like."
Mrs. Verloc thought for a moment.
Actually, he did use another name. I seem to recall him saying that the account was under the name of Pozor or something.
"Ah, good. Are you certain?"
Yes.
Just then the taxi arrived at the station.
"All right, we're there. You go on. I'll come later."
Ossipon paid the taxi driver and then followed the plan he had explained to Mrs. Verloc. Once she had her ticket, she boarded the train. Comrade Ossipon stood outside of her window and spoke to her in careful whispers.
"I had always found your brother to be an interesting young man, you know," he said. "In fact, the two of you looked quite similar to one another."
Thank you. Yes, he was a wonderful boy.
And then a wave of emotion came over Mrs. Verloc.
"Oh, Ossipon, I will love you for all of my days. You have been so good to me and to my brother. I do love you."
Ossipon looked up at the clock and saw that it was about time for the train to leave. He jumped aboard and encouraged Mrs. Verloc to sit against the far wall away from the platform window. As soon as the train started, he slowly walked backward toward the door of their carriage.
"Thank you so much, Ossipon. You've saved me."
And as soon as the train was moving at a quick enough speed, Comrade Ossipon opened the door and jumped out. He did not land on the ground properly and rolled for a while, head over feet. He lay on his back in the tall grass for a few moments. Nothing seemed to be broken. He then picked himself up and walked back toward the station. He decided that he would take a nice long walk through the city, back to his apartment. It would give him time to enjoy the fact that he now had more money than he had ever had before. Chapter 13. A couple of weeks later, Comrade Ossipon joined the professor for a beer at a local pub. He had before him a copy of a newspaper that was 10 days old.
"Why are you looking so sad?" asked the professor.
"You haven't lost one of your many girlfriends, have you?" Ossipon said nothing. Although he did not show it to the ugly little man across from him, there was an article in the paper that upset him. From the article he had learned that a mysterious woman, wearing all black, had boarded the evening boat going abroad. Several people approached her to ask if she was feeling well, for her face was terribly white, and at one point she had lain down across several seats as if dead tired. The captain of the boat decided that she needed to see a doctor immediately,
and sent for the police to come and take her to the nearest hospital. However, when they finally came, she was no longer there. The only thing to show that she had been there was her wedding ring. It was found on the seat where she had been lying. On the inside of the ring was written the date, June 24th, 1879. A little while later, one of the boat workers found the body of the same woman floating in the water of the English Channel. Ever since he had read that article, Ossipon could not feel good about himself. He began to drink a great deal, and he could no longer look at women, his favorite victims. The news of Mrs. Verloc's suicide was slowly driving him crazy.
"Look at you," said the professor. "You're lucky you've got so much money, and you can't even enjoy it. You make me sick." "Will you take the money?" he asked the professor. The ugly little man laughed to himself and then said, "I'll tell you what. There are a few materials that I need for some of my bomb projects. I'll make a list of what I need, and you just get the stuff for me. How's that?" Ossipon did not answer, but simply put his head in his hands. They then paid the bill and walked out into the filthy streets of London, one of them full of pain and guilt, the other full of hatred. The professor, with the bomb placed neatly inside of his coat, turned down a dark, narrow street and headed toward his home. He seemed nothing more than a strange, little, ugly man to the people who passed him along the way. But he was, of course, much more than that. He was death walking among the people.